Hello everyone, welcome back to Midnight Crime Story. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tonight I want to tell you about a case that proves justice has no expiration date. The story of how a single cigarette butt, carelessly discarded in 1980, finally caught a killer. Dorothy Dottie Selzel was a woman with big dreams living in Kent, Washington. She worked 2 jobs, teaching at Boeing during the day and serving at a local pizza restaurant at night, all while saving money to open her own cafe. She was the kind of person who made everyone around her believe in possibility. On February 23, 1980, Dottie was getting ready for a movie night with her best friend when a stranger decided to take everything away from her. For 44 years, her killer thought he'd gotten away with the perfect crime. He was wrong. This is the story of how modern science, patient detective work, and one overlooked piece of evidence finally brought justice to a woman who deserved so much more than the hand she was dealt. It's a reminder that some debts can never be forgotten, and some truths will always find their way to the surface. So, settle in as I take you through the remarkable case that shows us how persistence, technology, and a single Marlboro Red cigarette finally caught a killer who thought time was on his side. Dorothy Marie Selzel, everyone called her Dottie, had the kind of laugh that could fill a room and the kind of work ethic that impressed everyone she met. At 30 years old in 1980, Dottie was living what many would consider the perfect balance between stability and adventure in Kent, Washington, a growing suburb south of Seattle. During the day, Dottie worked as an instructor at Boeing, one of the most prestigious aerospace companies in the world. She'd landed the job 3 years earlier, right out of community college, where she'd studied technical education with a focus on manufacturing processes. Her colleagues at Boeing remember her as someone who could explain complex engineering concepts with patience and clarity, making her popular among both new hires and seasoned workers who needed refresher training. But Dottie's real passion came alive in the evenings. 3 nights a week, she worked at Tony's Pizza Palace, a local family-owned restaurant that had become a gathering place for Kent's young professionals and college students. The owner, Tony Marconi, had hired Dottie not just because she was reliable and friendly, but because she had dreams of opening her own restaurant someday. She wasn't just serving pizza, Tony would later tell investigators. She was studying every aspect of the business. She'd ask me about suppliers, about food costs, about how to handle difficult customers. Dottie had plans. Those plans were starting to take shape by February 1980. Dottie had been saving money from both jobs for almost 2 years, carefully building a nest egg that would help her launch her own small cafe. She'd even found a location she was interested in, a small storefront in downtown Kent that would be perfect for the breakfast and lunch crowd she wanted to attract. Dottie lived alone in a tidy apartment complex called Cedar Ridge, about 10 minutes from both her jobs. She'd moved there in 1978 after her relationship with her college boyfriend ended amicably. They'd simply grown in different directions. He wanted to travel the world, while Dottie wanted to put down roots in the Pacific Northwest. Her apartment was on the 2nd floor, overlooking a small courtyard where residents often gathered for impromptu barbecues during the summer months. Dottie was known for bringing homemade desserts to these gatherings, testing recipes she hoped to use in her future restaurant. Her chocolate chip cookies were legendary among her neighbors. February 23, 1980, started like any other Saturday for Dottie. She'd picked up an extra shift at Tony's the night before, working until nearly midnight to help cover for a coworker who'd called in sick. She slept in until almost 10 that morning, a rare luxury for someone who usually worked 6 days a week. Around noon, Dottie called her best friend Linda Patterson to make plans for the evening. Linda worked as a nurse at Valley Medical Center and had finally gotten a Saturday night off, something that rarely happened in her busy schedule. "We were going to go see Kramer versus Kramer at the Kent Cinema," Linda would later recall. Dottie had been wanting to see it for weeks, but our schedules never matched up. She was so excited to finally have a girls' night. The plan was simple. Linda would pick up Dottie around 7 p.m. They'd grab dinner at a quiet restaurant near the theater, catch the 8:30 show, and then maybe stop for coffee afterward to catch up on everything they'd missed in each other's lives. Dottie spent the afternoon doing laundry and cleaning her apartment. Her downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Chen, saw her carrying laundry baskets to the complex's washing machines around 3 p.m. They chatted briefly about the unusually warm weather they'd been having. It was nearly 60 degrees, unseasonably pleasant for February in Washington. She seemed perfectly normal, Mrs. Chen would tell police later. Happy even. She mentioned she was going to see a movie with Linda and was looking forward to it. She said she'd been working so much lately that she'd forgotten how nice it was to have plans with friends. That was the last conversation anyone would have with Dottie Silsall while she was alive. At 6:45 p.m., Linda Patterson pulled into the parking lot at Cedar Ridge Apartments, 15 minutes early as usual. Linda was perpetually punctual, a trait that served her well as a nurse, but sometimes frustrated her friends who operated on more relaxed schedules. She expected to wait in the car for a few minutes while Dottie finished getting ready. But when 7 p.m. came and went with no sign of Dottie, Linda began to worry. Dottie was usually ready and waiting, especially when she was excited about plans. Linda walked up to the second floor and knocked on apartment. No answer. Linda knocked again, louder this time. She could hear music playing inside. Dottie's radio was tuned to the soft rock station she always listened to while getting ready. But there was no movement, no sound of footsteps approaching the door. Dottie, Linda called out, "It's me. Are you ready?" Still nothing. Linda tried the door handle, not really expecting it to turn, but it did. The door was unlocked, which struck Linda as odd. Dottie was always careful about locking her door, especially when she was alone. "Dottie?" Linda called again as she stepped into the apartment. "I'm coming in." The living room looked normal. Dottie's purse was on the coffee table, her keys next to it. The radio was playing softly from the bedroom. Everything seemed peaceful, ordinary. But as Linda walked toward the bedroom, she began to sense that something was terribly wrong. The air felt different, heavy somehow, and there was a smell she couldn't quite identify, something metallic and disturbing. What Linda found in Dottie's bedroom would haunt her for the rest of her life. Dottie was lying on the floor next to her bed, partially dressed as if she'd been getting ready for their evening out. She wasn't moving. There was blood, more blood than Linda had ever seen, even in her years working in hospital emergency rooms. Linda's nurse training kicked in automatically. She checked for a pulse, knowing even as she did that it was too late. Dottie's skin was cold. She'd been dead for some time. With hands that were surprisingly steady despite the shock, Linda called 911 from Dottie's bedside phone. 911, what's your emergency? I need police and paramedics at Cedar Ridge Apartments, 50420 Southeast 2722nd Street, Apartment 23B. My friend is... She's been hurt. She's not breathing. I think she's dead. Ma'am, are you in a safe location? Is the person who hurt your friend still there? Linda looked around the apartment with new eyes, suddenly realizing that whoever had done this to Dottie might still be nearby. But the apartment felt empty, abandoned. I don't think so, she whispered into the phone. But I don't know. Please hurry. Detective Ray Morrison had been with the Kent Police Department for 12 years. When he got the call about a possible homicide at Cedar Ridge Apartments, he'd worked dozens of violent crimes. But something about this case felt different from the moment he arrived at the scene. The apartment complex was quiet that evening, with most residents either out for Saturday night entertainment or settled in watching television. The responding officers had already secured the scene and were interviewing Linda Patterson, who was sitting in the back of a patrol car, wrapped in a blanket and clearly in shock. Detective Morrison's first look at the crime scene told him several important things. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. Nothing appeared to be missing from the apartments. Dottie's purse contained over $200 in cash, plus credit cards and jewelry that any thief would have taken. This wasn't a random break-in either. There were no signs of forced entry. Either Dottie had known her attacker and let him in, or he'd somehow gained access to her apartment without her knowledge. The attack had been brutal and personal. The coroner would later determine that Dottie had been sexually assaulted and then beaten to death with what appeared to be a blunt object, possibly a hammer or similar tool that the killer had brought with him and taken when he left. But here's what made Detective Morrison pause. The scene was too clean in some ways, too messy in others. The killer had been careful about some things. He'd apparently worn gloves, as there were no clear fingerprints anywhere in the apartment. But he'd been careless about others. In the living room, Detective Morrison found something that would prove crucial decades later: a cigarette butt in an ashtray on Dottie's coffee table. The ashtray contained 3 butts, 2 with lipstick marks that clearly belonged to Dottie, and 1 without. "Did your friend smoke?" Detective Morrison asked Linda Patterson. "Yes, but only those long, thin cigarettes, Virginia Slims. She said they were more elegant," Linda replied. She was always trying to quit, but the stress of working 2 jobs made it hard. The 3rd cigarette butt was a Marlboro Red, a completely different brand and type. Someone else had been in Dottie's apartment that evening, someone who'd felt comfortable enough to sit in her living room and smoke. Detective Morrison carefully bagged the cigarette butt, though in 1980, DNA testing was still years away from being available to local police departments. He had no idea that this small piece of evidence would eventually solve the case, but his thoroughness in collecting every possible clue would prove crucial. The investigation expanded quickly. Detective Morrison and his team interviewed every resident of Cedar Ridge Apartments, everyone who worked at both of Dottie's jobs, and anyone who'd been seen in the area that evening. They learned that Dottie had been dating occasionally, but wasn't in a serious relationship with anyone. She'd gone out a few times with a man named Steve Coleman, who worked in Boeing's accounting department, but that had fizzled out several weeks earlier with no hard feelings on either side. "She said he was nice but boring," Linda Patterson told investigators. Dottie wanted someone with more ambition, someone who understood her dreams about opening a restaurant. The investigation revealed no obvious suspects, no jilted lovers, no angry coworkers, or disgruntled customers from the pizza place. Everyone who knew Dottie described her the same way: kind, hardworking, friendly but cautious, someone who didn't take unnecessary risks or put herself in dangerous situations. Detective Morrison worked the case for months, following every lead, re-interviewing witnesses, and expanding the search for anyone who might have had contact with Dottie. But as 1980 turned into 1981, the case began to grow cold. The cigarette butt and other evidence were carefully stored in the police department's evidence room, waiting for technology that didn't yet exist to unlock their secrets. For 20 years, Dorothy Silzel's murder file sat in a cabinet at the Kent Police Department. Detective Morrison retired in 1995, but not before passing the case on to Detective Sarah Kim, who inherited several dozen cold cases along with her promotion to the detective division. Detective Kim was known for her methodical approach and her refusal to give up on unsolved cases. Every few years, she would pull out Dottie's file and review it with fresh eyes, looking for connections or angles that earlier investigators might have missed. In the late 1990s, when DNA testing became more widely available, Detective Kim had the cigarette butt and other biological evidence tested. The results were promising. They were able to extract a clear male DNA profile from the cigarette, but when they ran it through the National DNA Database, there were no matches. The DNA evidence told them their suspect was male and gave them his genetic profile, but without a match in the system, it was just more information waiting for the right moment to become useful. Detective Kim reached out to Dottie's family and friends periodically, keeping them informed of any developments and asking if they'd remembered anything new. Linda Patterson, who'd found Dottie's body, had moved to California but stayed in touch with the investigation. She'd married, had children, and built a successful career as a hospital administrator. But she never forgot her friend or stopped hoping for justice. "I think about Dottie every February 23rd. Linda would tell Detective Kim during their annual phone calls. "I wonder who she would have married, what her restaurant would have looked like, what kind of life she would have built. Someone took all of that away and they just walked away like it didn't matter." Dottie's parents, Michael and Rose Silzel, held annual memorial services at their church in Tacoma. They'd started a small scholarship fund in Dottie's name for young women pursuing careers in technical fields. Every year they'd present the scholarship to a deserving student and tell her about their daughter's dreams and ambitions. "We don't want Dottie to be forgotten," Rose Silzel would say at these ceremonies. "She had so much to give to the world, even though her life was cut short. Maybe we can help other young women achieve the dreams she never got to fulfill." As the years passed, the case was transferred to different detectives as personnel changed. Each new investigator would review the file, run the DNA through updated databases, and pursue any new leads that emerged. But the case remained stubbornly unsolved. In 2015, Detective Marcus Webb took over the cold case unit and made Dottie's case one of his priorities. He was particularly interested and using new DNA techniques that could extract more information from older evidence. Detective Webb sent the cigarette butt to a specialized laboratory that could perform more advanced testing than had been available in the 1990s. The results confirmed the earlier findings and provided an even clearer genetic profile, but still no matches in any database. "We know exactly who killed Dorothy Silzel," Detective Webb would tell colleagues. "We just don't know who he is yet." Everything changed in 2023 when Detective Webb learned about forensic genetic genealogy, the same technique that had been solving cold cases across the country. He contacted Uthram Inc., a laboratory in Texas that specialized in using DNA evidence to build family trees and identify suspects through their relatives. Dr. Kristen Middleman, the forensic genealogist assigned to Dottie's case, began the painstaking process of building a genetic family tree from the cigarette butt DNA. The process took months of careful work, analyzing genetic markers and comparing them to DNA profiles in public genealogy databases. This case was particularly challenging because the DNA was from 1980, Dr. Middleman explained. The sample had degraded over time, and we had to use our most advanced techniques to extract enough genetic information to build a meaningful family tree. The breakthrough came in March 2024. Dr. Middleman identified a genetic match to someone who shared great-great-grandparents with the unknown suspect. From there, she began building an extensive family tree, working forward through generations to identify all possible descendants. The work required not just scientific expertise, but also traditional genealogical research. Dr. Middleman spent weeks in online archives, tracking birth certificates, marriage records, death certificates, and census data. She had to account for name changes, adoptions, and family migrations across multiple states. After 2 months of intensive research, Dr. Middleman had narrowed the possibilities to a handful of men who fit the genetic profile and would have been the right age in 1980. She passed her findings to Detective Webb, who began the delicate process of investigating each potential suspect. The first man on the list had died in 2010, and Detective Webb was able to confirm through medical records and family interviews that he'd been battling terminal cancer in 1980 and was unlikely to have been physically capable of the attack on Dottie. The second potential suspect had been living in Florida in 1980 and had no known connections to Washington state. Detective Webb's investigation showed that he'd been working steadily in Miami during the time period and had no apparent reason to be in Kent. The third name on the list was Kenneth Dwayne Kundert, age 65, currently living in Arkansas. When Detective Webb began researching Kundert's background, pieces started falling into place in a way that made his pulse quicken. In 1980, Kenneth Kundert had been 21 years old and living in the Pacific Northwest. He'd worked various jobs in construction and manual labor, moving frequently around Washington and Oregon. More significantly, Detective Webb discovered that Kundert had been working for a moving company in 1980, a job that would have given him access to apartment complexes and the ability to observe residents' routines. Even more compelling, Kundert had a history of violence against women. In 1983, he'd been arrested for assault in Oregon, but charges were dropped when the victim decided not to testify. In 1987, he'd been questioned in connection with another attack on a woman in Washington, but again, no charges were filed. Detective Webb also discovered that Kundert had abruptly left Washington in early 1981, just months after Dottie's murder, telling friends he was moving to Arkansas to be closer to family. But Detective Webb's research showed that Kundert had no family in Arkansas at the time. He'd simply disappeared from the Pacific Northwest. The circumstantial evidence was compelling, but Detective Webb needed definitive proof. He began planning a surveillance operation to obtain a DNA sample from Kundert for direct comparison to the cigarette butt evidence. The final piece. In July 2024, Detective Webb traveled to Arkansas with a team of investigators to conduct surveillance on Kenneth Kundert. They found him living in a modest house in Van Buren County, working part-time as a handyman and living on Social Security. Kundert's neighbors described him as quiet and somewhat antisocial. He'd never married, had no close friends, and kept to himself. Several people mentioned that he seemed to have a drinking problem and would sometimes make inappropriate comments about women, but nothing that rose to the level of criminal behavior. Detective Webb's team set up surveillance and waited for an opportunity to collect a DNA sample legally. They didn't have to wait long. On July 15, 2024, Kundert was observed throwing away trash at a local convenience store. Among the items he discarded was a cigarette butt, still his brand of choice, after all these years. Marlboro Reds. The discarded cigarette was carefully collected and sent to the lab for DNA testing. The results came back 3 weeks later. It was a perfect match to the DNA found at Dottie's crime scene, and Kenneth Dwayne Kundert was their killer. On August 20th, 2024, Kenneth Kundert was arrested at his home in Arkansas on a warrant for first-degree murder in the death of Dorothy Silzel. The arrest was peaceful. Kundert seemed almost resigned when officers arrived at his door. During the arrest, one of the Arkansas deputies noticed something that gave everyone chills. Kundert was smoking a Marlboro Red cigarette when they knocked on his door. After 44 years, he was still smoking the same brand that had ultimately led to his capture. Kundert was extradited to Washington State and charged with first-degree murder. His bail was set at $3 million, an amount that ensured he would remain in custody while awaiting trial. The arrest made national news. DNA evidence from a cigarette butt has led to an arrest in the 1980 killing of a woman in Washington State, police said this week. The case became an example of how advances in forensic genetic genealogy were solving decades-old crimes and bringing closure to families who had waited years for answers. Linda Patterson, now in her 70s and living in San Diego, flew to Washington for Kundert's arraignments. She sat in the front row of the courtroom, finally seeing the face of the man who had killed her best friend 44 years earlier. He looked so ordinary, she said afterward. For all these years I'd imagined some kind of monster, but he just looked like a tired old man. It's hard to believe that someone so unremarkable could have caused so much pain. Dottie's parents hadn't lived to see justice. Michael Silzel had died in 2010, and Rose in 2018. But their surviving children, Dottie's siblings, were present for the arraignment. Her brother Tom spoke to reporters afterward. Our parents never gave up hope that someday we'd know who killed Dottie, he said. They're not here to see it, but I believe they know. After 44 years, we finally have answers. In September 2024, facing overwhelming DNA evidence and a thorough investigation that had uncovered his history of violence against women, Kenneth Kundert decided to confess. His attorney arranged a plea hearing where Kundert would plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The confession was detailed and disturbing. Kundert explained that he'd been working for a moving company in 1980 and had noticed Dottie during several jobs at Cedar Ridge Apartments. He'd become obsessed with her, learning her routines and watching her come and go. On the evening of February 23, 1980, Kundert had followed Dottie home from Tony's Pizza Palace. He'd watched her apartment and noticed that she seemed to be getting ready to go out. When he saw her leave her apartment briefly to check her mail, he slipped inside through the unlocked door and waited for her to return. When Dottie came back to her apartment, she found Kundert sitting in her living room, smoking a cigarette. He claimed he'd initially planned just to talk to her, to ask her out on a date. But when Dottie became frightened and demanded that he leave, the situation escalated quickly. Kundert's confession revealed that the attack had been even more brutal than investigators had originally thought. He'd held Dottie captive in her own apartment for several hours, assaulting her repeatedly before finally killing her. After the murder, Kundert had cleaned up as much as possible, but he'd overlooked the cigarette butt in the ashtray, the single piece of evidence that would eventually lead to his capture 40. I thought I'd gotten away with it, Kundert told investigators during his confession. For all these years, I thought no one would ever figure it out. I never imagined that a cigarette could give me away after so long. Kenneth Kundert was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole in October 2024. At 65 years old, he will spend the rest of his life behind bars, finally paying for a crime he committed when he was young enough to think he could get away with anything. The sentencing hearing was emotional and powerful. Linda Patterson, now in her 70s, read a victim impact statement that brought tears to everyone in the courtroom. Dottie was going to change the world in her own small way, Linda said. She was going to open a restaurant that would have become the heart of our community. She was going to hire other young women and teach them about business and independence. She was going to get married someday and have children who would have grown up knowing how much their mother loved life and believed in the future. Linda paused, looking directly at Kundert, who sat with his head down at the defendant's table. "You didn't just kill my best friend," she continued. "You killed all the possibilities she represented. You stole not just her life, but all the lives she would have touched, all the good she would have done, all the love she would have given and received." Detective Webb, who had worked tirelessly to solve the case, was recognized by the Kent Police Department for his dedication, but he deflected the praise, saying that the real heroes were the scientists who had developed the technology to extract DNA from 44-year-old evidence, and the forensic genealogists who had the patience and skill to build family trees from genetic fragments. "This case shows that justice doesn't have an expiration date," Detective Webb said at the press conference following Kundert's sentencing. "No matter how much time passes, we'll never stop looking for answers." Dorothy Silzel deserved justice, and her family deserved to know the truth. The case also highlighted the importance of preserving evidence, even when current technology can't make use of it. The cigarette butt that solved Dottie's case had been carefully stored for more than 4 decades, waiting for science to advance enough to unlock its secrets. Dr. Middleman, the forensic genealogist who cracked the case, went on to solve dozens of other cold cases using similar techniques. She often spoke about Dottie's case as an example of how persistence and scientific advancement could finally bring answers to families who had waited decades for justice. "Every cold case represents someone's mother, daughter, sister, or friend," Dr. Middleman said in interviews after the case was solved. "These aren't just files in a cabinet, they're real people who deserved better, and families who deserve answers. Technology has given us the tools to provide those answers, even after decades have passed." The solution to Dorothy Silzel's case had ripple effects that extended far beyond the courtroom. The scholarship fund that her parents had established grew significantly after the case received national attention, allowing it to help even more young women pursue technical careers. Tony's Pizza Palace, where Dottie had worked and dreamed of opening her own restaurant, created a small memorial in her honor. Tony Marconi's son, who now runs the restaurant, keeps a photo of Dottie behind the counter and tells customers about the young woman who had worked there with such big dreams. "She would have been an amazing restaurant owner," Tony Jr. says. "She understood that food service isn't just about the food. It's about creating a place where people feel welcome and cared for. That's what she was doing here, and that's what she would have brought to her own place." Cedar Ridge Apartments, where Dottie lived and died, has changed management several times over the years, but the current owners maintain a small garden in the courtyard with a bench dedicated to Dottie's memory. Residents often sit there in the evenings, perhaps not knowing the full story, but sensing that it's a place that deserves respect and remembrance. Linda Patterson, who found her friend's body and lived with that trauma for 44 years, said that finally seeing justice brought a peace she hadn't expected. "I used to have nightmares about that night," she said in an interview 6 months after Kundert's conviction. "I'd dream about walking into Dottie's apartment and finding her, and I'd wake up feeling like I should have been able to save her somehow. But now I dream about her differently. I dream about her restaurant, about the life she should have had. The nightmares have stopped." The case also prompted changes in how police departments preserve and catalog evidence. The Kent Police Department implemented new protocols for long-term evidence storage, ensuring that future cold cases would have the best possible chance of being solved as technology continues to advance. "We learned that we can't predict what evidence will be crucial decades from now," said Chief Patricia Martinez of the Kent Police Department. "Our job is to collect everything carefully and preserve it properly, trusting that someday, somehow, science will give us the tools we need to find the truth." Today, if you visit Kent, Washington, you can still see traces of Dorothy Silzel's impact on her community. The scholarship bearing her name has helped more than 50 young women pursue careers in technical fields over the past 4 decades. Several of these women have gone on to start their own businesses, fulfilling in their own way the entrepreneurial dreams that Dottie never got to achieve. The Boeing facility where Dottie worked as an instructor has a small plaque in the training center that honors employees who made significant contributions to education and mentorship. Dottie's name is there, recognizing her dedication to helping others learn and grow in their careers. Kenneth Kundert, now serving his life sentence at the Washington State Penitentiary, will never be eligible for parole. He spends his days in a small cell, an old man paying for a crime he committed when he was young and thought he was invincible. Sometimes guards report he asks for cigarettes. Marlboro Reds, the same brand that ultimately led to his capture. The cigarette butt that solved the case is now part of a forensic science exhibit at the University of Washington. where it serves as a teaching tool for students studying criminal justice and forensic science. It's a small, unremarkable piece of evidence that represents something much larger: the power of persistence, the march of scientific progress, and the unwavering belief that every victim deserves justice, no matter how long it takes. Dorothy Silzel was 30 years old when her life was cut short by a man who thought he could take what he wanted and walk away without consequences. She never got to open her restaurant, never got to marry and have children, never got to see how her kindness and determination might have changed her corner of the world. But in the end, justice found its way to her killer. Science gave investigators the tools they needed. Dedicated detectives refused to give up, and a single cigarette butt, carelessly discarded 44 years ago, finally revealed the truth. Dottie's story reminds us that some debts can never be forgotten, some crimes can never be ignored, and some victims will never be abandoned. In a world that often seems to move too fast and forget too easily, her case stands as proof that patience, persistence, and science can still triumph over those who think they're clever enough to get away with murder. The last word belongs to Linda Patterson, the friend who found Dottie's body and never stopped believing that someday there would be answers. Dottie always said that good things come to those who work hard and never give up on their dreams. She was talking about her restaurant and her plans for the future, but I think she was also talking about justice. It took 44 years, but her killer was finally caught. Good things do come to those who never give up, even when it takes nearly half a century for those good things to arrive. Dorothy Marie Silzel, 1950-1980. Beloved daughter, loyal friend, dedicated worker, and dreamer of better days. Finally at rest, finally at peace, finally vindicated by the long arc of justice that bends, however slowly, toward truth. Please, if you're still awake, listening to the stories and haven't subscribed, please consider supporting my channel. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions are what fuel my content creation. Let's build a community together. Now let's move to our next story. Story 2. Tonight we're traveling to the affluent suburbs of Connecticut to explore a case that captivated the nation and finally reached its conclusion. And this is the story of Jennifer Dulos, a loving mother of 5 whose disappearance on a seemingly ordinary Friday morning would unravel a web of deception, betrayal, and ultimately murder. Our story begins not with Jennifer's disappearance, but with the life she was trying to build, and the marriage that was slowly destroying her from within. Jennifer Faber-Dulos seemed to have everything that many would consider a perfect life. Born in 1968, she grew up in a well-to-do family in New York, eventually pursuing her education and meeting Fotis Dulos, a charming Greek-American man who worked in luxury home construction. Their early years together painted the picture of an American dream, a successful couple building a life in the picturesque town of New Canaan, Connecticut. New Canaan is the kind of place where white picket fences aren't just a metaphor, they're a reality. Tree-lined streets wind past colonial homes with manicured lawns, where the biggest concern for most residents might be which country club to join or which private school offers the best college prep program. It's a town where a family can raise children in safety, where neighbors know each other by name, and where violent crime is virtually unheard of. Jennifer and Fotis settled into this idyllic community, and over the years, their family grew. 5 beautiful children filled their large home on Wells Lane, each child representing another thread in what appeared to be a tapestry of suburban bliss. Jennifer threw herself into motherhood with the same dedication she brought to everything else in her life. She was the mother who never missed a soccer game, who volunteered at school events, who made sure her children felt loved and supported in every endeavor. But beneath this picture-perfect exterior, cracks were beginning to show. Those who knew Jennifer well began to notice subtle changes. The woman who once seemed so confident, so assured in her place in the world, began to seem more guarded, more careful with her words. Friends would later recall conversations where Jennifer seemed to be choosing her words carefully, as if she were afraid of saying too much. Fotis Dulos, meanwhile, was building his reputation as a successful developer. His company, 4 Group, specialized in luxury custom homes throughout Fairfield County. He was charming, articulate, and had an undeniable presence that drew people to him. But those same qualities that made him attractive in business and social settings were beginning to manifest in more troubling ways at home. The marriage that had once seemed so solid was developing fault lines that ran deeper than anyone on the outside could see. Financial pressures were mounting as Fotis's business ventures became increasingly ambitious and increasingly risky. The luxury lifestyle they had built required constant funding, and the pressure to maintain appearances in their affluent community added another layer of stress to their relationship. By 2017, Jennifer had made a decision that would set in motion the events leading to her disappearance. She filed for divorce, a decision that marked the beginning of the end of the life she had built in New Canaan. But divorce, even in the most amicable circumstances, can be complicated when it involves significant assets, custody of 5 children, and 2 people who have grown to see each other as adversaries rather than partners. It becomes something far more dangerous. The divorce proceedings between Jennifer and Fotis were anything but amicable. What began as a dissolution of marriage quickly evolved into a bitter battle that would drag on for 2 years, with each side accusing the other of increasingly serious misconduct. Jennifer's court filings painted a picture of a marriage that had become toxic. She described Fotis as controlling, manipulative, and increasingly volatile. In her statements to the court, she detailed incidents where she felt threatened, where his behavior had become unpredictable and frightening. She spoke of fearing for her safety and the safety of their children, concerns that the court took seriously enough to impose strict supervision requirements for Fotis's visits with the children. The custody battle became particularly contentious. Jennifer was seeking primary custody, arguing that Fotis's behavior had become erratic and that he posed a potential danger to their children. Fotis, meanwhile, painted Jennifer as an unfit mother who was attempting to alienate him from his children. The legal briefs flew back and forth, each more accusatory than the last, each revealing more about the toxic dynamic that had developed between 2 people who had once promised to love each other until death do them part. Financial issues compounded the personal animosity. The couple's assets were substantial but complicated, with properties, business interests, and investments all requiring valuation and division. Fotis's construction business was struggling, despite its prestigious reputation, and the legal fees from the protracted divorce were mounting on both sides. During this period, Fotis began a relationship with Michelle Troconis, a woman who worked in public relations and had connections to the exclusive world of Fairfield County society. Troconis was attractive, sophisticated, and seemed to offer Fotis the admiration and support that his marriage to Jennifer no longer provided. But her entry into Fotis's life would ultimately make her a central figure in the tragedy that was about to unfold. Jennifer, meanwhile, was trying to build a new life for herself and her children. She had moved to a home on Wells Lane in New Canaan, a property that offered both the luxury her children were accustomed to and the security she desperately needed. She was working with her attorney to finalize the divorce and establish a custody arrangement that would protect her children while allowing them to maintain a relationship with their father. But Fotis was growing increasingly desperate. His business was failing, the divorce was costing him a fortune in legal fees, and he was facing the prospect of losing not only his wife, but also regular access to his children. Court documents would later reveal the depth of his financial problems, mounting debts, failed business ventures, and the constant pressure to maintain the lifestyle that had become his identity. By the spring of 2019, the situation had reached a breaking point. The divorce case was approaching resolution, but not in a way that favored Fotis. He was facing the reality of significant alimony payments, limited custody of his children, and the division of assets that would leave him in a precarious financial position. For a man who had built his identity around success and control, the prospect of losing everything he valued most was becoming unbearable. Jennifer, meanwhile, was finally beginning to see light at the end of the tunnel. The divorce would soon be final, and she could begin to build the life she wanted for herself and her children. She had no way of knowing that her estranged husband was already planning to ensure that this new life would never become reality. Friday, May 24th, 2019, began like any other morning in the Doulos household on Wells Lane. Jennifer woke early, as was her custom, to prepare for another day in the carefully orchestrated routine that kept her family running smoothly. The children needed to be ready for school, lunches needed to be packed, and the 1,000 small details that make up a mother's morning needed to be managed with the precision that Jennifer had perfected over years of practice. The house on Wells Lane was more than just a home. It was Jennifer's sanctuary. After the chaos and conflict of her marriage to Fotis, this place represented safety, stability, and the hope of a better future for her and her children. The neighborhood was quiet and safe, the kind of place where children could ride their bikes without fear and where neighbors looked out for one another. Jennifer's routine that morning was typical. She made breakfast, ensured the children were ready for their day, and began the process of getting them to their various schools and activities. The logistics of managing 5 children's schedules was complex, but Jennifer had it down to a science. Each child had their specific needs, their particular activities, and their individual schedules that needed to be coordinated with military precision. After dropping the children off at their respective schools, Jennifer returned home around 8:05 a.m. Security cameras in the neighborhood captured her garage door opening as she pulled her black 2017 Chevrolet Suburban into the driveway. This would be the last confirmed sighting of Jennifer Dulos alive. What happened next can only be reconstructed from the evidence left behind, the testimony of witnesses, and the careful detective work that would follow. But investigators believe that Fotis Dulos was already in the house, having gained entry while Jennifer was out with the children. He had been planning this moment, waiting for the right opportunity when Jennifer would be alone and vulnerable. The confrontation that followed was violent and decisive. Evidence would later suggest that Jennifer was attacked in her own garage, the place where she should have been safest. The medical examiner would later testify that she likely suffered traumatic blunt force injuries that would have been fatal. In the space of minutes, the life that Jennifer had been fighting so hard to build for herself and her children was brutally ended. But Fotis's plan extended far beyond the murder itself. He had come prepared not just to kill Jennifer, but to dispose of her body and any evidence that might connect him to the crime. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of uncontrolled rage. This was a calculated, premeditated act designed to eliminate the woman who stood between him and the life he believed he deserved. The cleanup that followed was methodical and extensive. Fotis had brought supplies, cleaning materials, garbage bags, and other items that suggested he had planned not just the murder, but also its aftermath. He worked quickly, knowing that Jennifer's failure to pick up the children from school would eventually raise alarms and bring unwanted attention to the house on Wells Lane. By late morning, Jennifer was supposed to pick up her children from school, appointments she never missed. When she failed to appear, school officials tried calling her. When she didn't answer, they called friends and family members. The network of people who cared about Jennifer began to mobilize, sensing that something was terribly wrong. The first sign that something was amiss came when Jennifer's friends received calls from the school asking if they knew why Jennifer hadn't picked up her children. These were people who knew Jennifer well, who understood that missing a school pickup was completely out of character for her. They began making calls, checking with other friends, trying to piece together Jennifer's movements that morning. The New Canaan Police Department received their first call about Jennifer Dulos at approximately 7:30 p.m. on May 24th, when friends who had been unable to reach her finally decided to request a welfare check. Officer Thomas Patton was dispatched to the house on Wells Lane to investigate what initially seemed like a routine concern about a missing person. What Officer Patton found when he arrived at Jennifer's home immediately elevated the situation from a welfare check to a potential crime scene. Jennifer's black Chevrolet Suburban was parked in the garage, but there was no sign of Jennifer herself. More troubling were the signs that something violent had occurred, evidence that would later be described as indicating a serious assault had taken place. The New Canaan police, recognizing the seriousness of the situation, immediately called in the Connecticut State Police Major Crime Squad. This was no longer a simple missing person case. The evidence at the scene clearly indicated that Jennifer had been the victim of a violent crime, even though her body was nowhere to be found. Detective Kevin Duggan, a veteran investigator with the Connecticut State Police, took charge of the case. Duggan had seen his share of violent crimes during his career, but the Dulos case presented some unique challenges. They had evidence of a violent crime but no body. They had a victim who had clearly been planning for a future with her children, but who had seemingly vanished without a trace. The first priority was securing the crime scene and beginning the painstaking process of evidence collection. The house on Wells Lane was treated as a crime scene, with investigators photographing every detail, collecting potential evidence, and trying to reconstruct what had happened that morning. The garage in particular showed signs of the violence that had occurred there. Meanwhile, other investigators began the process of tracking Jennifer's movements on the morning of her disappearance. Security cameras throughout the affluent neighborhood provided a timeline of her activities. showing her leaving with the children and returning alone. But they also revealed something else. Evidence of another vehicle in the area that morning, a vehicle that would prove to be crucial to the investigation. As news of Jennifer's disappearance spread through the community, the response was immediate and overwhelming. New Canaan was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where a crime like this was virtually unthinkable. Neighbors organized search parties, volunteers distributed flyers, and the entire community mobilized to help find Jennifer. But while the community was focused on finding Jennifer, investigators were already beginning to focus on the most obvious suspect, her estranged husband, Fotis Doulos. The bitter divorce, the custody battle, and the financial pressures he was facing all pointed to motive. But having a motive and proving guilt were two very different things. Fotis, when contacted by police, expressed appropriate concern for his missing wife. He cooperated with the initial investigation, providing alibis and expressing his hope that Jennifer would be found safe. But investigators noticed inconsistencies in his statements, gaps in his timeline, and behaviors that seemed inconsistent with an innocent man whose estranged wife had disappeared. The investigation quickly expanded beyond the immediate crime scene. Investigators began examining cell phone records, credit card transactions, and any other digital footprints that might provide clues about what had happened to Jennifer. They interviewed friends, family members, and anyone who might have information about the state of the Doulos marriage or Jennifer's frame of mind in the days leading up to her disappearance. One of the most significant breaks in the case came from an unexpected source: security cameras at various locations throughout the Hartford area. On the evening of Jennifer's disappearance, these cameras captured footage of a man and woman disposing of garbage bags in multiple dumpsters throughout the city. The man appeared to be Fotis Doulos, and the woman appeared to be his girlfriend, Michelle Troconis. The security camera footage from Hartford proved to be the breakthrough that investigators needed. The images were grainy and taken from a distance, but they clearly showed a man resembling Fotis Doulos and a woman resembling Michelle Troconis systematically disposing of garbage bags in dumpsters throughout the city. This wasn't random disposal. It was a deliberate pattern designed to scatter evidence across multiple locations. Investigators immediately obtained warrants to search these dumpsters, and what they found confirmed their worst fears. Among the discarded items were pieces of clothing that appeared to be stained with blood, cleaning supplies, and other items that suggested someone had been engaged in cleaning up after a violent crime. DNA testing would later confirm that the blood belonged to Jennifer Doulos. But perhaps the most damning piece of evidence was a license plate that had been discarded along with the other items. This license plate belonged to Jennifer's missing Chevrolet Suburban, suggesting that Fotis had not only killed Jennifer, but had also disposed of her vehicle somewhere else. The investigation into Michelle Troconis' role in the events of May 24th revealed the extent to which she had become involved in Fotis' plan. Phone records showed that she and Fotis had been in contact throughout the day, and cell tower data placed her with him during the crucial hours when the cleanup and disposal were taking place. When brought in for questioning, Troconis initially maintained her innocence, claiming that she had no knowledge of what Fotis had done. But as investigators presented her with evidence, the security camera footage, the cell phone records, the timeline that placed her at various locations with Fotis, her story began to change. In subsequent interviews, Troconis admitted that she had been with Fotis when he disposed of the garbage bags, but claimed that she didn't know what was in them. She said that Fotis had told her they contained old household items that he was throwing away and that she had no reason to suspect anything more sinister. But investigators weren't buying her story. The pattern of disposal, the late-night timing, and the systematic nature of their actions all suggested that this was a carefully planned operation, not the casual disposal of household items. Moreover, other evidence suggested that Troconis had been aware of the conflict between Jennifer and Fotis, and had even made statements suggesting that she viewed Jennifer as an obstacle to her relationship with Fotis. As the investigation progressed, a third conspirator emerged: Kent Mulwiney, Fotis' friend and attorney. Mulwiney had been helping Fotis with legal issues related to both his business and his divorce, and investigators discovered that he had also been involved in some of the planning that preceded Jennifer's murder. Cell phone records showed that Mulwiney had been in contact with Fotis in the days leading up to Jennifer's disappearance, and investigators found evidence that he had conducted internet searches related to disposing of bodies and avoiding detection by law enforcement. He had also made statements to others that suggested he knew more about Jennifer's fate than he was admitting. The case against all three conspirators was building steadily, but prosecutors knew they faced a significant challenge. They still didn't have Jennifer's body, while they had substantial evidence that she had been murdered. Proving the case beyond a reasonable doubt without the victim's body would require careful preparation and presentation of the evidence they did have. In January 2020, the Connecticut State's Attorney's Office announced that Fotis Dulos, Michelle Troconis, and Kent Mawhinney were being charged in connection with Jennifer's murder. Fotis was charged with capital murder, murder and kidnapping, while Troconis and Mawhinney were charged with conspiracy to commit murder and other related charges. But before the case could go to trial, tragedy struck again. On January 28, 2020, Fotis Dulos was found in his garage, having apparently attempted suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. He was rushed to the hospital, but died 2 days later without ever regaining consciousness. His death meant that the full truth about what happened to Jennifer might never be known. But it didn't end the legal proceedings against his alleged co-conspirators. With Fotis Dulos' death, the focus of the case shifted to Michelle Troconis and Kent Mawhinney. Prosecutors were determined to hold all those responsible for Jennifer's murder accountable, even if the alleged mastermind would never face trial. Michelle Troconis' trial began in January 2024, nearly 5 years after Jennifer's disappearance. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman who had been fully aware of her boyfriend's plan to murder his estranged wife, and who had actively participated in covering up the crime. They presented evidence of her presence during the cleanup and disposal of evidence, her changing stories to investigators, and her apparent knowledge of the conflict between Jennifer and Fotis. The defense argued that Troconis had been manipulated by Fotis, that she was an unwitting participant in his scheme, who had no knowledge of his true intentions. They portrayed her as another victim of Fotis' deception, a woman who had fallen in love with a charming man who had hidden his true nature from her. But the jury wasn't convinced by the defense's arguments. On March 9, 2024, after deliberating for several days, they found Michelle Troconis guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, tampering with evidence, and hindering prosecution. The verdict brought a measure of justice for Jennifer's family and friends, even though it couldn't bring her back. In June 2024, Troconis was sentenced to more than 14 years in prison for her role in Jennifer's murder. At the sentencing hearing, Jennifer's family and friends spoke about the impact of her loss, describing a woman who had been devoted to her children and who had been working to build a better life for her family when her life was so brutally cut short. Throughout all of this, Jennifer's body has never been found. Investigators have searched numerous locations based on tips and evidence, but Jennifer's final resting place remains unknown. For her family and friends, this adds another layer of pain to an already unbearable loss. They cannot lay her to rest, cannot visit a grave, cannot have the closure that comes with a proper burial. In October 2023, a Connecticut judge officially declared Jennifer Dulos legally dead, nearly 4.5 years after her disappearance. The declaration was necessary for legal and financial reasons, but it also provided a form of official recognition of what everyone already knew, that Jennifer had been murdered and would never be coming home to her children. The case of Jennifer Dulos represents both the best and worst of human nature. It shows us the depths to which jealousy, greed, and narcissism can drive someone. But it also shows us the dedication of law enforcement officers who never gave up on seeking justice for a victim they never met. It shows us the power of a community coming together to support a family in crisis, and the strength of friends and family who refused to let Jennifer be forgotten. Jennifer's 5 children, now being raised by her mother and sister, continue to be the focus of everyone who loved her. They are growing up knowing that their mother loved them enough to fight for their safety and their future, even though that fight ultimately cost her her life. They are surrounded by people who ensure that Jennifer's memory remains alive, that her love for them continues to be a present force in their lives. As we conclude this story, we remember Jennifer Dulos, not as a victim, but as a mother who loved her children, a woman who fought for what she believed was right, and a person whose life had value and meaning that extended far beyond the tragic way it ended. Her story serves as a reminder of the dangers that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly perfect lives, and the importance of taking seriously the fears of those who say they feel threatened by someone they once loved. The town of New Canaan has returned to its quiet routine, but the memory of Jennifer Dulos remains. Her story has become part of the community's history, a reminder that tragedy can strike anywhere, but also that justice, however long delayed, can still be achieved. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember Jennifer Dulas, a mother, a friend, a woman who deserved better than the fate that befell her, but whose memory continues to inspire those who fight for justice and those who refuse to forget. Story 3. The morning of January 1st, 2023, dawned crisp and bright in Cohasset, Massachusetts, a picturesque coastal town where the sound of waves mingles with the whisper of wind through bare winter trees. It was the kind of New Year's Day that promised fresh starts and new beginnings. But for one family on Chief Justice Cushing Highway, it would mark the beginning of a mystery that would captivate the nation and reveal dark secrets hidden beneath the veneer of suburban prosperity. Anna Walshy should have been preparing for another busy day. The 39-year-old mother of 3 had built a successful career in real estate, splitting her time between the family's home in Cohasset and her work in Washington, D.C., where she managed luxury properties for wealthy clients. She was the kind of woman who seemed to effortlessly balance the demands of motherhood with a thriving career, someone who could navigate boardroom negotiations in the morning and help with homework in the evening. But Anna never made it to her planned New Year's Day flight to Washington. She never hugged her 3 young sons goodbye. She never walked out the front door of the home she shared with her husband, Brian Walshy, a man whose own secrets were about to unravel in ways that would shock even those who thought they knew him best. To understand what happened to Anna Walshy, we must first understand who she was, beyond the tragic circumstances that would make her name known across America. Anna was born in Serbia and had immigrated to the United States as a young woman, bringing with her the determination and resilience that would define her adult life. She had worked hard to build her career in real estate, establishing herself in the competitive Washington, D.C. market where success requires not just business acumen, but also the ability to connect with people from all walks of life. Those who knew Anna described her as vivacious and warm, the kind of person who lit up a room when she entered. She spoke multiple languages fluently and had used her international background to connect with clients from around the world. Her success in real estate wasn't just about closing deals. It was about understanding what people needed to feel at home, whether they were buying their first modest apartment or their 5th luxury estate. But perhaps more than anything, Anna was devoted to her 3 young sons. Friends and colleagues often spoke of how she would rearrange her schedule to attend school events, how she would take conference calls while sitting in the bleachers at soccer games, how she somehow managed to be fully present for her children despite the demands of her career. She was the kind of mother who made being a working parent look effortless, though those closest to her knew the careful planning and constant juggling that made it all possible. Her marriage to Brian Walshy had, from the outside, seemed like a partnership between 2 successful people building a life together. Brian was involved in art dealing and had connections to high-end collectors and galleries. The couple lived in a beautiful home in Cohasset, a town known for its excellent schools and close-knit community. Their 3 boys were thriving, and Anna's career was flourishing. It was, by all appearances, the American dream made manifest. But beneath this picture-perfect surface, there were cracks that most people never saw. Brian's business dealings were more complicated than they appeared, and his relationship with the truth was becoming increasingly tenuous. The art world, with its high-stakes transactions and emphasis on provenance and authenticity, requires absolute integrity. Brian's approach to business was about to prove that he lacked this essential quality. Brian Walshy's involvement in the art world had begun legitimately enough. He had connections to galleries and collectors, and he understood the market for high-end pieces. But somewhere along the way, Brian began to see opportunities that existed in the gray areas between legitimate business and outright fraud. The scheme that would eventually lead to federal charges began with 2 paintings that Brian claimed were authentic works by Andy Warhol. The paintings, according to Brian, had been inherited from his father's collection and were worth approximately $80. He consigned them to a gallery in Seoul, South Korea, representing them as genuine Warhol pieces and providing documentation that seemed to support their authenticity. But the paintings were not authentic, Warhol's. They were sophisticated forgeries, and Brian knew it. The documentation he had provided was fabricated, and the entire transaction was built on lies. When the South Korean gallery discovered the deception, they demanded their money back, but Brian had already spent the proceeds from the sale. This wasn't a moment of poor judgment or a single lapse in ethics. Investigation would later reveal that Brian had been involved in multiple fraudulent art transactions, using his knowledge of the art world to exploit buyers and sellers who trusted his representations. He had developed a pattern of representing fake or misattributed works as authentic pieces by famous artists, collecting the money and then creating elaborate stories to explain why the works couldn't be delivered or why the transactions had to be reversed. The federal investigation into Brian's art fraud activities was ongoing as 2022 turned into 2023. He was facing serious criminal charges that carried the possibility of significant prison time. The stress of the investigation, combined with mounting legal bills and the potential destruction of his reputation, was creating enormous pressure in his life. But Brian's legal troubles were about to become the least of his problems. His wife Anna was successful, intelligent, and increasingly aware that something was seriously wrong with her husband's business dealings. She was asking questions that Brian didn't want to answer, and she was in a position to expose the full extent of his deceptions. For a man who had built his adult life on creating false narratives and manipulating the truth to his advantage, Anna's growing awareness of his criminal activities represented an existential threat. She had the financial independence to leave him, the intelligence to understand the implications of his crimes, and the moral clarity to recognize that she could not continue to be associated with his fraudulent activities. The final days of December 2022 were tense in the Walshy household. Anna had been asking increasingly pointed questions about Brian's business activities, his legal troubles, and their family's financial situation. She had her own successful career and her own resources, which meant she wasn't financially dependent on Brian in the way that might have made her more willing to overlook his problems. Friends and colleagues who spoke to Anna during this period would later describe her as seeming stressed and distracted. She was still professional in her work, still devoted to her children, but there was an underlying tension that those closest to her began to notice. She was dealing with the realization that the man she had married, the father of her children, had been living a double life. Brian, meanwhile, was facing mounting pressure from multiple directions. The federal investigation into his art fraud was progressing, and he knew that criminal charges were likely. His legal bills were mounting, and his ability to generate legitimate income was compromised by the cloud of suspicion that surrounded his business dealings. Most importantly, he was facing the prospect of losing everything he valued: his freedom, his family, and his ability to maintain the lifestyle he had become accustomed to. On December 31st, 2022, the Walshy family celebrated New Year's Eve together at their home in Cohasset. To their 3 young sons, it was just another family celebration. They had no way of knowing that their father was already planning to ensure that their mother would never see another new year. Anna had planned to fly to Washington, D.C. on January 1st for work meetings. She had reservations at a hotel, appointments scheduled with clients, and plans to return to Massachusetts later in the week. It was a routine business trip, the kind she had made hundreds of times before, but Brian had decided that this trip, and all future trips, would never happen. January 1st, 2023, began like any other morning in the Walshy household, at least from the perspective of the 3 young boys who lived there. Their parents were up early, moving through the familiar routines of breakfast and preparation for the day ahead. Anna was preparing for her trip to Washington, checking her luggage and reviewing her schedule for the meetings she would never attend. But Brian was also preparing for something that morning, something that his sons would mercifully never witness. In the basement of their home, he had already assembled the tools he would need for what was to come: a hacksaw, cleaning supplies, garbage bags, and other implements that suggested he had been planning this moment for some time. The attack, when it came, was swift and brutal. Anna likely had no warning, no opportunity to defend herself or to call for help. She was killed in her own home, in the place where she should have been safest, by the man who had promised to love and protect her until death do them part. But Brian's plan extended far beyond the murder itself. He had thought through the aftermath, the cleanup and the disposal of evidence. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of uncontrolled rage. It was a calculated act designed to eliminate the person who posed the greatest threat to his freedom and his future. Using the hacksaw he had prepared, Brian dismembered Anna's body in the basement of their home. The task was gruesome and methodical, requiring hours of work that demonstrated a level of planning and cold-bloodedness that would shock even experienced investigators. He double-bagged the remains and prepared them for disposal, all while his 3 young sons slept upstairs, unaware that their mother would never tuck them in again. The cleanup was extensive and thorough. Brian scrubbed the basement, disposed of blood-stained materials, and worked to eliminate any physical evidence of what had occurred. He had planned not just the murder but also the cover-up, understanding that he would need to create a believable story to explain Anna's disappearance. When Anna failed to take her scheduled flight to Washington on January 1st, Brian began the performance of his life. He contacted her employer, expressing concern that she hadn't arrived for her meetings. He reached out to friends and family members, asking if they had heard from her. He even filed a missing person report with the Cohasset police, playing the role of the worried husband whose wife had mysteriously vanished. But Brian's performance, convincing as it might have seemed initially, contained inconsistencies that trained investigators began to notice almost immediately. His timeline of Anna's movements on January 1st didn't align with other evidence. His explanations for his own activities that day contained gaps and contradictions. Most tellingly, his emotional responses seemed calculated rather than genuine. Detective Kevin Proctor of the Cohasset Police Department was one of the first investigators to interview Brian about Anna's disappearance. Proctor had been investigating missing person cases for years, and he understood the difference between a genuinely distraught spouse and someone who was performing the role of a concerned husband. Brian's responses to questions about Anna's disappearance raised red flags immediately. The first major break in the case came when investigators examined Brian's internet search history. Using his son's iPad, Brian had conducted a series of searches that revealed his true intentions and his methods. The searches included queries about the best ways to dispose of a body, how to clean up bloodstains, and what happens to bodies after death. These weren't the searches of an innocent man trying to find his missing wife. They were the searches of someone who had already committed murder and was trying to cover his tracks. Additional evidence began to accumulate quickly. Surveillance cameras in the area captured Brian making multiple trips to dumpsters and disposal sites in the days following Anna's disappearance. Store receipts showed that he had purchased cleaning supplies, garbage bags, and other materials consistent with cleaning up after a violent crime. Cell phone data placed him at various locations where he was disposing of evidence, despite his claims to investigators that he had been at home caring for his children. As the investigation progressed, the evidence against Brian Walshy continued to mount. Investigators found bloodstains in the basement of the family home, despite Brian's attempts to clean up after the murder. DNA testing confirmed that the blood belonged to Anna, providing definitive proof that she had been killed in the house. The hacksaw that Brian had used to dismember Anna's body was recovered from a dumpster where he had disposed of it. The tool contained traces of Anna's blood and DNA, directly linking Brian to the method used to dispose of her remains. Other evidence recovered from various disposal sites included clothing stained with Anna's blood, cleaning supplies used in the cleanup, and personal items that had belonged to Anna. Perhaps most damning was the timeline that investigators were able to construct using cell phone data, surveillance cameras, and other digital evidence. They could track Brian's movements on January 1st and in the days that followed, showing how he had spent hours disposing of evidence while simultaneously maintaining the fiction that he was a worried husband searching for his missing wife. Brian's internet search history provided a window into his state of mind in his planning process. The searches began days before Anna's murder, suggesting that he had been planning the crime for some time. They included specific queries about dismemberment, body disposal, and crime scene cleanup, information that no innocent person would need to research. The evidence also revealed the extent of Brian's deception in the days following Anna's murder. While publicly expressing concern for his wife's safety and pleading for information about her whereabouts, he was privately disposing of her remains and destroying evidence of his crime. The contrast between his public persona and his private actions demonstrated a level of callousness that investigators found particularly disturbing. On January 8, 2023, exactly 1 week after Anna's disappearance, Brian Walshy was arrested and charged with misleading investigators in the search for his wife. The initial charges were relatively minor, but they allowed investigators to hold Brian, while they continued to build their case for more serious charges. As the evidence continued to accumulate, the charges against Brian were upgraded to include murder in the first degree, improper conveyance of a human body, and additional counts of misleading investigators. The Norfolk County District Attorney's Office announced that they believed Brian had killed Anna in their Cohasset home and then disposed of her body in a way that made recovery unlikely. The announcement of murder charges against Brian sent shockwaves through the community of Cohasset and beyond. Anna's friends and colleagues expressed their grief and disbelief that someone they had known and trusted could be capable of such violence. The three Walshy children, suddenly orphaned by their father's actions, were placed in the care of Anna's family members, who would help them navigate the impossible situation they now faced. Brian's federal art fraud case, which had been proceeding through the courts while the murder investigation was ongoing, took on new significance in light of the murder charges. Prosecutors argued that the stress of the federal investigation and the prospect of prison time had provided Brian with a motive for killing Anna, who represented both a potential witness against him and someone whose continued presence in his life would make maintaining his deceptions impossible. The case also revealed the extent to which Brian had been living a double life. While presenting himself as a successful art dealer and devoted family man, he had been engaged in systematic fraud and was planning the murder of his wife. The contrast between his public persona and his private actions demonstrated a level of deception that extended far beyond his criminal activities. Despite the wealth of evidence against Brian Walshy, one crucial element remained missing: Anna's body. Brian had been thorough in his disposal of her remains, and despite extensive searches of landfills, waterways, and other potential disposal sites, investigators were unable to recover Anna's body. The search for Anna's remains became a massive undertaking involving multiple law enforcement agencies, search and rescue teams, and specialized equipment. Investigators used cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and other technologies to search locations where Brian might have disposed of the body. They examined hundreds of hours of surveillance footage and followed up on numerous tips from the public. The inability to recover Anna's body was heartbreaking for her family and friends, who were denied the closure that comes with a proper burial. It also presented challenges for prosecutors, who would need to prove that Anna was dead and that Brian had killed her without being able to present her body as evidence. However, the circumstantial evidence against Brian was overwhelming. The combination of physical evidence, digital evidence, and Brian's own contradictory statements created a compelling case for murder, even without the recovery of Anna's body. Prosecutors were confident that they could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Brian had killed Anna and disposed of her remains. The case also highlighted the sophisticated methods that modern investigators use to solve crimes. Digital forensics, DNA analysis, cell phone data, and surveillance technology all played crucial roles in building the case against Brian. The investigation demonstrated how difficult it has become for criminals to completely cover their tracks in an era where digital footprints and physical evidence can be preserved and analyzed with unprecedented precision. As this story is being told, Brian Walshy's trial for the murder of his wife Anna is scheduled to begin in October. The case has garnered national attention, not just because of the brutal nature of the crime, but also because of the way it illustrates how ordinary-seeming lives can hide extraordinary deceptions and violence. The trial will likely focus on the extensive evidence that investigators have gathered linking Brian to Anna's murder. Prosecutors will present the physical evidence found at the crime scene, the digital evidence showing Brian's internet searches and movements, and the timeline of events that demonstrates his guilt. They will argue that Brian killed Anna because she represented a threat to his freedom and his ability to continue his fraudulent lifestyle. Brian's defense team faces a challenging task in countering the evidence against their clients. They may argue that the evidence is circumstantial, that Brian's internet searches and movements can be explained by innocent activities, and that the prosecution has not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Anna is dead or that Brian killed her. But the evidence against Brian appears to be overwhelming, and legal experts who have followed the case believe that a conviction is likely. The combination of physical evidence, digital evidence, and Brian's own contradictory statements creates a compelling narrative of guilt that will be difficult for the defense to counter. The trial will also provide an opportunity for Anna's family and friends to share their memories of her, and to ensure that she is remembered not just as a victim, but as a person who lived a full and meaningful life. They will speak about her love for her children, her success in her career, and the positive impact she had on everyone who knew her. While the murder case was developing, Brian Walshy's federal art fraud case proceeded through the courts. In February 2024, he was sentenced to 37 months in federal prison for his role in the fake Andy Warhol painting scheme. The sentence was to run concurrently with any state sentence he might receive if convicted of murdering Anna. The federal case provided additional insight into Brian's character and his willingness to engage in systematic deception for financial gain. The art fraud scheme required him to create false documentation, lie to galleries and collectors, and maintain elaborate deceptions over extended periods of time. These same skills in deception and manipulation that he used in his art fraud activities were also evident in his attempts to cover up Anna's murder. The federal conviction also established a pattern of criminal behavior that prosecutors in the murder case could use to demonstrate Brian's character and his willingness to commit serious crimes when it served his purposes. The art fraud case showed that Brian was capable of sustained deception and that he was willing to break the law when he believed he could get away with it. The timing of the federal case, which was ongoing at the time of Anna's murder, also provided prosecutors with a potential motive for the killing. Brian was facing the prospect of federal prison time, the loss of his reputation, and financial ruin. Anna's knowledge of his criminal activities and her potential testimony against him made her a significant threat to his freedom and his future. The murder of Anna Walshy had a profound impact on the community of Cohasset and the broader region. Cohasset is a small, close-knit town where violent crime is rare and where neighbors know and trust each other. The revelation that a respected member of the community had brutally murdered his wife in their family home shattered many people's sense of security and trust. Local residents struggled to understand how someone they had interacted with socially, whose children played with their children, could be capable of such violence. The case forced many people to reconsider their assumptions about the people in their lives and to recognize that domestic violence can exist behind even the most perfect-seeming facades. The case also highlighted the particular vulnerabilities faced by successful women, like Anna. Her financial independence and professional success, which should have provided her with security and options, may have actually made her more of a target for a husband who was facing the loss of his own status and freedom. The case demonstrated how domestic violence can escalate when abusers feel that they are losing control over their victims. Support services for domestic violence victims in the area saw an increase in calls and requests for help following Anna's murder. The case served as a wake-up call for many people about the warning signs of domestic violence and the importance of taking threats seriously. Community organizations used Anna's story to educate people about the resources available to those who find themselves in dangerous relationships. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the Anna Walshy case is the impact on her 3 young sons. These children lost their mother to violence and their father to his own criminal choices, leaving them orphaned and traumatized by circumstances they had no power to control or understand. Anna's family has stepped in to care for the children, working to provide them with stability and support during an incredibly difficult time. The boys are receiving counseling and other support services to help them process the trauma of losing their mother and learning about their father's crimes. The children's financial security has been protected through Anna's estate and life insurance policies, ensuring that they will have the resources they need for their education and care. But no amount of money can compensate for the loss of their mother or the trauma of learning that their father was responsible for her death. As the boys grow older, they will have to grapple with the complex legacy of their parents, a mother who loved them deeply and worked hard to provide for them, and a father whose criminal choices destroyed their family. They will need ongoing support to help them understand their history and to build healthy lives despite the trauma they have experienced. Anna's family and friends are committed to ensuring that the boys know about their mother's love for them and her hopes for their future. They are working to preserve Anna's memory and to help the children understand that they are not defined by their father's crimes but by their mother's love and their own potential. The case of Anna Walshy raises important questions about justice, accountability, and the nature of domestic violence. Brian Walshy's crimes were not the result of a momentary loss of control or a single bad decision. They were the culmination of a pattern of deception, manipulation, and criminal behavior that spanned years. The sophistication of Brian's planning and execution of Anna's murder, combined with his attempts to cover up the crime, demonstrate a level of callousness that is difficult to comprehend. He was willing to destroy his family, traumatize his children, and end the life of the woman who had borne his children, all to protect himself from the consequences of his own criminal choices. The case also highlights the importance of believing victims of domestic violence and taking their concerns seriously. While we may never know the extent to which Anna was aware of the danger she faced, her friends and family have spoken about noticing changes in her behavior in the months before her death that suggested she was under stress and feeling threatened. The investigation and prosecution of this case demonstrate the dedication of law enforcement officers and prosecutors to seeking justice for victims of violent crime. Despite the challenges presented by Brian's attempts to destroy evidence and cover up his crimes, Investigators were able to build a compelling case through careful analysis of physical evidence, digital evidence, and witness testimony. As we reflect on the story of Anna Walshe, we are reminded of the preciousness of life and the devastating impact that violence can have on families and communities. Anna was a successful professional, a devoted mother, and a beloved friend who had every reason to believe that her life was just beginning to unfold in new and positive ways. Her murder represents not just the loss of her individual life, but the loss of all the contributions she would have made to her children's lives, her community, and her profession. The 3 boys she left behind will grow up without their mother's guidance, love, and support, and the world has lost someone who made it a better place through her work and her relationships. But Anna's legacy also includes the way her story has educated people about domestic violence, the importance of supporting victims, and the need to hold perpetrators accountable for their crimes. Her death was not in vain if it helps other people recognize the warning signs of abuse and take action to protect themselves or others. The investigation and prosecution of Brian Walshe also demonstrate the commitment of the justice system to holding perpetrators accountable for their crimes, even when they go to great lengths to cover up their actions. The sophisticated investigative techniques used in this case, and the dedication of the investigators and prosecutors involved, show that justice can still be achieved even in the most challenging circumstances. The story of Anna Walshe is ultimately a story about the collision between appearance and reality, between the lives we present to the world and the secrets we hide behind closed doors. It is a story about love and betrayal, success and failure, hope and despair. Anna Walshe deserved better than the fate that befell her. She deserved to see her children grow up, to continue building her successful career, and to find happiness and peace in her life. Instead, she became the victim of a man who valued his own freedom and comfort more than her life and the well-being of their children. But her story also demonstrates the resilience of the human spirit and the power of truth to ultimately prevail over deception. Despite Brian's attempts to cover up his crimes and escape accountability, the truth emerged through the dedication of investigators and the persistence of those who loved Anna and refused to let her disappearance go unsolved. As Brian Walshe prepares to face trial for his wife's murder, Anna's memory lives on in the hearts of those who loved her and in the lives of the 3 sons she left behind. Her story serves as a reminder of the importance of cherishing the people we love, recognizing the signs of danger in our relationships, and never giving up the fight for justice and truth. The case continues to unfold, but one thing is certain: Anna Walshe will not be forgotten, and those responsible for her death will be held accountable for their crimes. In a world where violence and deception can sometimes seem to triumph, her story reminds us that justice, though sometimes delayed, can still be achieved, and that the truth, however carefully hidden, will eventually come to light. If you're still awake and listening, please don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our next story. Story 4. Tonight I will also share with you a case that has haunted the Pacific Northwest for over a year now. It's a story that begins on a rain-soaked Thursday evening in Portland, Oregon, and unfolds into one of the most perplexing disappearances. October 12th, 2023, started like any other Thursday for Jessica Martinez. She woke up in her cozy apartment on Southeast Division Street, one of those converted Victorian houses that Portland is famous for. The morning rain was gentle against her bedroom window, creating that soft pattering sound that locals have grown to love. Jessica had moved to Portland 3 years earlier from Sacramento, drawn by the city's creative energy and coffee culture. She worked as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm downtown, specializing in logos for local breweries and restaurants. Her colleagues described her as reliable, creative, and someone who always remembered your birthday. At 28, Jessica had built a quiet but fulfilling life in the Rose City. She lived alone except for her rescue cat, a gray tabby named Moki, who had a habit of knocking plants off her windowsill. Her apartment reflected her artistic nature, walls covered with her own photography from weekend hikes in the Columbia River Gorge, shelves lined with books about design and true crime podcasts she'd bookmarked for later. That Thursday morning, Jessica followed her usual routine. She made coffee in her French press, always the same blend from a local roaster on Hawthorne Boulevard. She checked her email while Mochi wound around her legs, hoping for an early breakfast. She watered her collection of succulents that lined the kitchen windowsill, something she'd been doing religiously since moving to Portland. Her morning was unremarkable. She responded to a few client emails, sketched some ideas for a new brewery logo, and scrolled through Instagram while finishing her coffee. At 8:30, she grabbed her messenger bag, the one with patches from various music venues she'd visited, and headed out into the drizzle. The commute from her apartment to downtown Portland was about 20 minutes by bus. Jessica preferred public transit to driving. It gave her time to read or listen to podcasts. That morning, she was halfway through a true crime podcast about missing persons cases in the Pacific Northwest. She had no way of knowing that within hours, she would become part of a similar story. Her coworkers at Cascade Creative remembered seeing her that morning around 9:15. She seemed normal, maybe a little tired. She'd stayed up late the night before working on a freelance project. She wore her usual work attire, dark jeans, a forest green sweater, and her favorite leather ankle boots. Her long dark hair was pulled back in a low ponytail, and she carried her vintage camera bag alongside her laptop case. The day proceeded normally. Jessica attended a client meeting at 10 a.m., worked on revisions for a restaurant logo, and had lunch with her coworker and friend Samantha Chen at a Vietnamese place they frequented on 3rd Avenue. Samantha would later tell police that Jessica seemed her usual self, talking about a hiking trip she was planning for the weekend, complaining mildly about her upstairs neighbor's loud music, discussing a book she'd just finished. The afternoon was typical as well. Jessica worked on a presentation for the next day's client meeting, responded to emails, and participated in the weekly team check-in at 3 p.m. Her boss, David Kim, noted that she seemed focused and engaged, contributing ideas for an upcoming campaign. At 4:30, Jessica started packing up her desk. She had an appointment at 5:15, a dental cleaning she'd been putting off for months. The dental office was on Northwest 23rd Avenue in the trendy Nob Hill district. It should have been routine. It should have been forgettable. But somewhere between leaving her office that afternoon and what should have been a simple dental appointment, Jessica Martinez vanished. The last person to see her at work was the security guard, Michael Rodriguez, who was manning the front desk of the office building. He remembered Jessica because she stopped to ask about weekend parking rules. She was thinking of coming in Saturday to catch up on a project. Michael told police she seemed relaxed, maybe even in a good mood. She waved goodbye and walked out into the October afternoon. It was 4:35 p.m. The rain had stopped, and weak afternoon sunlight was filtering through the Portland clouds. Jessica had exactly 40 minutes to make a 15-minute journey to her dentist office. It should have been more than enough time. But Jessica Martinez never made it to her appointment. She never made it home that night. She simply vanished somewhere in the heart of Portland, leaving behind only questions and a growing sense of unease that would soon grip the entire city. Dr. Sarah Hoffman had been Jessica's dentist for 2 years. She ran a small practice in Nob Hill, the kind of neighborhood where vintage shops sit next to upscale restaurants and coffee shops that charge $5 for a latte. Hoffman was known for being punctual and expecting the same from her patients. When Jessica didn't show up for her 5:15 appointment, Dr. Hoffman wasn't immediately concerned. Patients sometimes ran late, especially on rainy Portland afternoons, when traffic could be unpredictable. She used the time to catch up on patient notes and prepared for her next appointment. By 5:30, when Jessica still hadn't arrived and hadn't called, Dr. Hoffman asked her receptionist, Lisa, to try calling Jessica's phone. The call went straight to voicemail. Lisa left a message asking Jessica to call back to reschedule, mentioning that they understood things come up. That evening, Jessica's absence began to ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. Her friend Samantha Chen tried calling around 7 p.m. They had tentative plans to catch a movie that weekend, and Samantha wanted to confirm the time. Like Doc Hoffman's office, Samantha's call went straight to voicemail. Samantha wasn't worried at first. Jessica sometimes forgot to charge her phone, or she might have been at one of the coffee shops on Division Street where the signal was spotty. Samantha sent a text and went on with her evening, assuming she'd hear back from Jessica by the next morning. But it was Jessica's upstairs neighbor, Trevor Mitchell, who first sensed something was truly wrong. Trevor was a graduate student at Portland State University, studying urban planning. He lived in the converted attic of the same Victorian house where Jessica rented the first-floor apartment. Trevor had gotten to know Jessica's routines over the past year. She was a creature of habit, home by 6:30 most weeknights. Always greeting Mochi with the same sing-song voice, usually cooking dinner while listening to music or podcasts. The sounds of her evening routine had become comforting background noise to Trevor's own studies. That Thursday night, the silence from Jessica's apartment felt wrong. By 8 p.m., Trevor hadn't heard any of the usual sounds. No key in the lock, no hello to Mochi, no music or television. Most concerning of all, he could hear Mochi crying. The cat's meows were insistent, almost frantic, completely unlike his usual quiet demeanor. Trevor knocked on Jessica's door around 8:30. No answer. He called her name, knocked louder. Still nothing. The crying from Mochi grew more intense. Trevor tried calling Jessica's phone, straight to voicemail. Something was definitely wrong. Trevor had Jessica's emergency contact information, because they'd exchanged numbers when she first moved in, part of being good neighbors in case of any building issues. Her emergency contact was her sister Maria Martinez, who lived in Sacramento. Trevor called Maria at 9:15 p.m. The conversation was awkward at first. Maria barely knew Trevor, and he felt strange calling about her sister. But as Trevor explained his concerns, Maria's voice grew tense. "Jessica always calls me Thursday nights," Maria told Trevor. "We have a standing phone date. She never misses it unless she tells me in advance. And she would never leave Mochi alone without making arrangements." Maria tried calling Jessica's phone. Voicemail. She called Jessica's work number, straight to the office voicemail system. She tried Jessica's friend Samantha, whose number Jessica had given her for emergencies. Samantha confirmed she hadn't heard from Jessica since lunch. Now 2 people who knew Jessica well were worried, and their concern was growing with each passing hour. By 10 p.m., Maria had made the decision to call the Portland Police Bureau's non-emergency line. She explained that her sister was missing, that she'd failed to show up for an appointment and wasn't answering her phone. The operator was professional but not particularly concerned. Adults were allowed to be unreachable for a few hours. They suggested waiting until morning and calling back if Jessica still couldn't be located. But Maria couldn't wait. She called her husband, Luis, who worked for the California Highway Patrol. Luis knew that while police departments often had unofficial 24 or 48-hour waiting periods for missing adults, there was no legal requirement to wait. If family members were genuinely concerned, a report could be filed immediately. Luis called the Portland Police Bureau and spoke with a desk sergeant, explaining that his sister-in-law had missed appointments, wasn't answering her phone, and that her behavior was completely out of character. The sergeant agreed to send an officer to do a welfare check at Jessica's apartment. Officer Jennifer Park arrived at Jessica's building on Southeast Division Street at 11:45 p.m. Trevor met her at the front door, and together they went to Jessica's apartment. Officer Park knocked loudly, announced herself, listened for any response. Nothing but Mochi's increasingly desperate cries from inside. The building's landlord, Mrs. Chen, no relation to Jessica's friend Samantha, lived just 6 blocks away. Officer Park called her, explaining the situation. Mrs. Chen, a woman in her 70s who'd been renting apartments in Portland for 30 years, agreed to come over with keys. Mrs. Chen arrived at 12:20 a.m., now technically Friday the 13th. She unlocked Jessica's apartment door, and Officer Park stepped inside, calling Jessica's name as she went. The apartment was empty, but everything else about it suggested Jessica had expected to return home that evening. Her morning coffee cup sat washed and drying by the sink. A note to herself about grocery shopping was stuck to her refrigerator. Her bed was made, but her pajamas were laid out on top of the comforter. Jessica's habit when she planned to be home for the evening. Most telling of all, Mochi's food and water bowls were empty. Jessica never would have left her cat without food, unless she expected to be back within a few hours. Officer Park made notes, took some initial photographs, and asked Trevor and Mrs. Chen about Jessica's habits, friends, and any recent changes in behavior. Everything they told her painted a picture of a stable, responsible young woman who wouldn't simply disappear without telling anyone. At 12:50 a.m. on Friday, October 13th, 2023, Officer Jennifer Park filed the first official missing person report for Jessica Elena Martinez. The case was assigned number 23 MP 408047, and Jessica became one of thousands of missing persons reported to police departments across the country each year. But Jessica's case would soon prove to be anything but routine. Detective Lisa Reyes had been with the Portland Police Bureau for 12 years, the last 5 in the missing persons unit. She'd worked everything from runaway teenagers to complex adult disappearances, and she'd developed an instinct for which cases would resolve quickly and which would become long-term mysteries. When she reviewed Jessica Martinez's file on Friday morning, October 13th, Detective Reyes felt that familiar knot in her stomach that told her this wasn't going to be simple. Jessica's profile didn't fit the typical patterns of voluntary disappearance. She had stable employment, close family relationships, no known financial problems, and no history of mental health crises. Her social media accounts showed no signs of distress or plans to leave Portland. Most importantly, she had a beloved pet that she would never abandon. Detective Reyes began by retracing Jessica's last known movements. Security cameras at Jessica's office building showed her leaving at 4:35 p.m. on Thursday, exactly as the security guard had reported. She was alone, walking north toward the bus stop on 3rd Avenue. Portland's public transit system, TriMet, had security cameras on most buses, and Detective Reyes requested footage from the routes Jessica typically took to get from downtown to the Nob Hill area. This was where the investigation hit its first significant roadblock. The number 20 bus, which Jessica normally took, had a malfunctioning security camera that Thursday afternoon. The backup camera system had also failed earlier in the week and hadn't been repaired yet. There was no video record of whether Jessica had boarded her usual bus. Detective Reyes interviewed the bus driver who worked that route, a veteran TriMet employee named Robert Johnson. Robert had been driving Portland buses for 15 years and had developed a good memory for regular passengers. But October 12th had been particularly busy due to a Blazers game downtown, and Robert couldn't specifically remember seeing Jessica that afternoon. The detective expanded her canvas to other bus routes Jessica might have taken. The number 15 bus also ran from downtown to Nob Hill, taking a slightly different route. That camera system was working, and Detective Reyes spent hours reviewing footage from Thursday afternoon. She found nothing. No sign of Jessica on any of the buses she would have logically taken to reach her dentist appointment. This raised the first major question in the case. If Jessica hadn't taken public transit, how had she planned to get to Nob Hill? She didn't own a car, and there was no record of her calling a rideshare service. Her credit card showed no charges for taxi fare that afternoon. Detective Reyes began considering alternative scenarios. Perhaps Jessica had decided to walk to her appointment. It was about 1.5 miles from her office. Definitely walkable for someone who hiked regularly. The walking would have taken her through some of Portland's busiest areas, including the Pearl District and the Transit Mall. Surely someone would have seen her. The detective requested surveillance footage from businesses along the most logical walking routes between Jessica's office and Dr. Hoffman's practice. This was painstaking work, involving calls to dozens of shop owners, restaurant managers, and office building security companies. Most businesses were cooperative, but the footage quality varied dramatically. Some cameras were positioned to capture only the immediate storefront, missing pedestrians on the sidewalk. Others had been overwritten or corrupted. The investigation was turning into a digital archaeological dig through dozens of hours of security footage. Meanwhile, Detective Reyes was also building a comprehensive picture of Jessica's life, looking for anything that might explain her disappearance. She interviewed Jessica's coworkers, friends, neighbors, and family members. She examined Jessica's phone records, bank statements, and social media activity. Jessica's cell phone had last pinged a tower near her office building at 4:42 p.m. on Thursday. After that, the phone had either been turned off or had lost power. Phone company records showed no unusual activity in the days leading up to her disappearance. Typical calls to family and friends, work-related communications, and a few calls to local businesses. Her bank account showed normal activity. The last transaction was a coffee purchase at 2:15 p.m. on Thursday at a cafe near her office, consistent with her usual afternoon routine. There were no large withdrawals, no suspicious charges, no evidence of financial distress. Jessica's social media presence painted a picture of a content, engaged young woman. Her Instagram account showed photos from recent hikes, pictures of mochi, and shots of her design work. Her last post was from Tuesday evening, a photo of a sunset over the Portland skyline taken from the East Bank Esplanade. The caption read, "Fall in Portland never gets old. Grateful for this beautiful city." There was nothing in Jessica's digital footprint to suggest she was planning to disappear or that she was in any kind of trouble. Detective Reyes also examined Jessica's apartment more thoroughly. With the family's permission, she and a crime scene technician spent several hours documenting everything. They found no signs of struggle, no evidence that Jessica had packed for a trip, no notes or letters that might explain an intentional disappearance. Jessica's passport was in a drawer in her bedroom. Her hiking gear was organized in her closet. Her laptop showed she'd been working on client projects as recently as Wednesday evening. Everything suggested a woman who was planning to continue her normal routine. By the end of Jessica's first week as a missing person, Detective Reyes had more questions than answers. The case had all the hallmarks of an involuntary disappearance, but there was no evidence of where, when, or how Jessica had encountered trouble. The investigation was about to expand in ways that would capture Portland's attention and eventually make Jessica Martinez's disappearance one of the most talked about missing persons cases in the Pacific Northwest. By Monday, October 16th, 4 days after Jessica's disappearance, her case had begun to attract public attention. Maria Martinez had arrived in Portland over the weekend, and she wasn't content to wait quietly while the police investigation proceeded at its methodical pace. Maria was a high school English teacher in Sacramento, but she had a background in journalism from her college years. She understood the power of media attention in missing persons cases, and she was determined to keep Jessica's story in the public eye. Working with Jessica's friend Samantha Chen, Maria organized a search party for that first weekend. They created flyers with Jessica's photo and last known location, distributed them throughout southeast Portland and the Nob Hill area, and posted them on social media. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Portland's community spirit, already strong, seemed to rally particularly around Jessica's story. Perhaps it was because she represented so many of the young people who had moved to Portland in recent years, creative, independent, drawn to the city's culture and natural beauty. Volunteers showed up at Laurelhurst Park on Saturday morning, October 14th. They came with their own supplies: water bottles, snacks, cell phone chargers, and comfortable walking shoes. Some brought their dogs. Others brought cameras to document the search. The organized search covered a 6-square-mile area between Jessica's office and her intended destination. Volunteers walked in grid patterns through parks, parking lots, and alleys. They knocked on doors, showed Jessica's photo to shopkeepers and restaurant workers, and checked dumpsters and construction sites. Nothing. No trace of Jessica, no witnesses who remembered seeing her that Thursday afternoon. But the search effort had an unexpected benefit. Local news stations began covering the story, and Jessica's disappearance became a regular feature on Portland's evening news broadcasts. The coverage was respectful and thorough, focusing on the facts of the case and the ongoing search efforts. Detective Reyes was initially frustrated by the media attention. In her experience, high-profile cases could be harder to investigate because of the flood of tips, conspiracy theories, and false sightings that publicity often generated. But she also recognized that media coverage could be invaluable in generating legitimate leads. The Portland Police Bureau set up a tip line specifically for Jessica's case. In the first week after her disappearance, they received over 200 calls. Most were well-intentioned, but not helpful. People who thought they might have seen Jessica in various parts of the city, usually several days after her disappearance. But some tips were more intriguing. A barista at a coffee shop on Northwest 23rd Avenue, just 2 blocks from Dr. Hoffman's dental office, called to report that a woman matching Jessica's description had come in around 5:00 p.m. on Thursday, October. The woman had seemed nervous, kept checking her phone, and had left quickly without finishing her drink. Detective Reyes interviewed the barista, a college student named Alex Thompson. Alex was certain about the timing. He'd been watching the clock because his shift ended at 5:30. He described the woman as having long dark hair, wearing a green sweater and dark jeans, carrying a leather bag. The description matched what Jessica had been wearing that day. But when Detective Reyes showed Alex Jessica's photo, he couldn't definitively confirm it was her. The lighting in the coffee shop had been dim, and Alex admitted he hadn't paid close attention to the customer's face. Still, it was the first potential sighting of Jessica anywhere near her intended destination. Detective Reyes requested security footage from the coffee shop, but like many small businesses, they only kept recordings for 72 hours. By the time police requested the footage, it had already been overwritten. Another tip came from a dog walker in Laurelhurst Park, about halfway between downtown and Nob Hill. Sarah Kim had been walking her golden retriever around 5:15 p.m. on Thursday when she noticed a woman sitting alone on a bench near the park's duck pond. The woman appeared to be upset, possibly crying, and was talking on her phone. Sarah described the woman as having dark hair and wearing a green top, again consistent with Jessica's appearance that day. But Sarah had been some distance away and couldn't provide more specific details. She'd continued her walk and hadn't thought about the incident until she saw Jessica's photo on the news. Detective Reyes visited the park and interviewed Sarah in person. The bench Sarah described was along one of the walking paths that Jessica might have taken if she decided to walk to her appointment through the park. It was a route that would have avoided the busier downtown streets. But without security cameras in the park and no other witnesses to corroborate Sarah's account, the potential sighting remained just that, potential. As the investigation entered its second week, Detective Reyes was dealing with the classic challenge of missing persons cases. Too many possibilities and too few concrete facts. Jessica could have encountered trouble anywhere along a dozen different routes through Portland. She could have been the victim of a random crime, or she could have been targeted by someone who knew her routine. The detective began focusing on Jessica's personal relationships, looking for any signs of conflict or unusual behavior in the weeks before her disappearance. She re-interviewed Jessica's co-workers, probing deeper into office dynamics and Jessica's interactions with clients and vendors. She also examined Jessica's dating life. Jessica had been single for about 6 months, following the end of a 2-year relationship with a man named David Park. David had moved to Seattle for work in April 2023, and by all accounts the breakup had been amicable. Detective Reyes contacted David in Seattle. He was shocked to learn about Jessica's disappearance and immediately cooperative with the investigation. He provided phone records showing no recent contact with Jessica, and his work schedule confirmed he'd been in Seattle all week leading up to her disappearance. Jessica's friends confirmed that she hadn't been seriously dating anyone recently, though she occasionally went on first dates arranged through dating apps. Detective Reyes obtained access to Jessica's dating app accounts and found nothing unusual. Typical conversations with potential matches, a few first dates that hadn't led to second dates. Nothing that suggested conflict or danger. By the end of October, Jessica Martinez had been missing for more than 2 weeks. The initial flood of tips had slowed to a trickle. The organized search efforts had covered hundreds of square miles without finding any trace of her. Detective Reyes was beginning to face the reality that Jessica's case might become a long-term investigation, the kind that could drag on for months or even years without resolution. But she wasn't ready to give up, and neither was Jessica's family or the Portland community that had embraced her story. The case was about to take an unexpected turn that would refocus the entire investigation. November 3rd, 2023, 3 weeks after Jessica's disappearance, brought the first significant break in the case. It came from an unexpected source, a homeless man named Robert Bobby Williams, who lived in a camp along the Willamette River. Bobby had been living on Portland streets for nearly 2 years, part of the city's ongoing homelessness crisis. He'd set up a small tent in a wooded area near the East Bank Esplanade, close enough to downtown to access services, but secluded enough to avoid frequent police sweeps. Bobby had heard about Jessica's disappearance through word of mouth in the homeless community. Many unhoused individuals paid close attention to missing persons cases, partly out of solidarity with vulnerable people, and partly because they were often witnesses to events that others missed. On November 3rd, Bobby was walking along the riverbank, looking for recyclable cans and bottles, when he spotted something metallic glinting in the shallow water near the base of the Hawthorne Bridge. At first he thought it might be a piece of car debris. The area sometimes collected trash that washed downstream from the city. But as Bobby waded into the cold water to investigate, he realized he was looking at a cell phone. The device was partially buried in river silt, and the screen was dark and cracked. But Bobby could see it was a newer model smartphone, not the kind of thing that would be discarded carelessly. Bobby had seen enough news coverage to know that Jessica Martinez's phone had never been found. He carefully retrieved the device from the water and walked to the nearest police station. a journey of about 15 minutes from his riverside camp. The desk sergeant who received Bobby's report was initially skeptical. Phones ended up in the river regularly, dropped by pedestrians on bridges, thrown away by thieves after stealing them, lost during parties along the waterfront. But when Bobby explained his theory about the missing woman, the sergeant decided to take the device seriously. Detective Reyes was called in to examine the phone. Despite its time in the water, she could see it was an iPhone 12 Pro in a distinctive purple case, the same model and color that Jessica's family had described. The phone was completely dead, but forensic technicians at the Oregon State Police Crime Lab might be able to recover data from its memory. The location where Bobby found the phone was significant. The Hawthorne Bridge area was not on any of the logical routes between Jessica's office and her dentist appointments. If Jessica had dropped or lost her phone there, it suggested she had deviated significantly from her intended path. Detective Reyes examined the riverbank area where the phone was found. The East Bank Esplanade was a popular walking and biking path, busy during daylight hours but less trafficked in the evening. Someone could have thrown the phone from the bridge above, or it could have been dropped or lost along the waterfront path. More troubling was the possibility that the phone's location was connected to Jessica's fate. The Willamette River had been searched by dive teams in the days after Jessica's disappearance, but the search had focused on areas closer to downtown. The Hawthorne Bridge area had been checked visually but not thoroughly searched. Detective Reyes requested that the dive team return to examine the river more thoroughly around the Hawthorne Bridge. The search was scheduled for November 6th, contingent on weather conditions and river levels. Meanwhile, the forensic analysis of Jessica's phone began at the State Crime Lab. The technicians warned that water damage often made data recovery impossible. The newer phones sometimes had better sealed components that could survive brief submersion. The phone had been in the water for at least 3 weeks, possibly since the day Jessica disappeared. River water, with its sediment and bacteria, was particularly damaging to electronic devices. The forensic team would need several days to determine what, if anything, could be recovered. Detective Reyes also expanded her investigation of the Hawthorne Bridge area. She interviewed residents of nearby apartments and condominiums, asking if anyone had seen Jessica or noticed anything unusual on the evening of October. She requested security footage from businesses along the waterfront. The East Bank Esplanade had limited security cameras, mainly at the entrances to parks and near major intersections. The Detective Reyes found one camera that captured a portion of the walking path near where the phone was discovered. The footage from October 12th showed typical early evening activity: joggers, dog walkers, cyclists heading home from work. The camera's angle and limited night vision made it difficult to identify specific individuals, but Detective Reyes could see several people had passed through the area between 5. One figure caught her attention: a person walking alone, moving quickly along the path around 6:15 p.m. The individual appeared to be wearing dark clothing and carrying a bag, but the image quality was too poor to determine gender or other identifying characteristics. Detective Reyes had the footage enhanced by the Crime Lab's digital forensics unit. The enhancement revealed slightly more detail, but not enough to positively identify the person as Jessica or anyone else. Still, the timing was significant. 6:15 p.m. was well after Jessica's dental appointment time, and it suggested someone had been in the area during the window when she was unaccounted for. The dive team's search on November 6th was thorough and heartbreaking. Using sonar equipment and underwater cameras, the divers systematically searched the river bottom around the Hawthorne Bridge area. They found the usual river debris, shopping carts, bicycles, car parts, and scattered personal belongings that had accumulated over years. But they found no sign of Jessica Martinez. The search did reveal something else that would prove important to the case. Evidence that the area where the phone was discovered was a known dumping spot. The divers found several other electronic devices, phones, tablets, and laptops that appeared to have been deliberately thrown into the river. This discovery raised new questions about Jessica's phone. It had been discarded there intentionally, possibly by someone trying to prevent its contents from being discovered. Or had it ended up in the river by accident, perhaps dropped during some kind of struggle? Detective Reyes was still waiting for the forensic analysis results when the case took another unexpected turn. On November 8th, exactly 4 weeks after Jessica's disappearance, a second witness came forward with information that would reshape the entire investigation. Margaret Chen, no relation to Jessica's friend Samantha or her landlord, Mrs. Chen, had been struggling with whether to contact police for weeks. Margaret was a retired librarian who lived in a high-rise apartment building overlooking the Hawthorne Bridge. She'd been following Jessica's case in the news and felt increasingly troubled by something she'd witnessed on the night of Jessica's disappearance. On the evening of October 12th, Margaret had been reading in her apartment when she heard what sounded like an argument outside. Her building was 12 stories tall, and her apartment on the 9th floor offered a clear view of the East Bank Esplanade below. Margaret had looked out her window and seen two people on the walking path, appearing to be in some kind of confrontation. Margaret's eyesight wasn't what it used to be, and the October evening was overcast, making visibility poor. She could see that one person appeared to be a woman with long dark hair, wearing what looked like a light-colored top. The other person was taller, possibly male, wearing darker clothing. The interaction lasted only a few minutes, but Margaret could tell it was heated. She saw gesturing, what appeared to be raised voices, and the woman seemed to be trying to walk away while the other person followed her. Margaret had considered calling police at the time, but the confrontation seemed to end when the two people separated. The woman walked quickly away toward downtown, while the other person headed in the opposite direction. Margaret had returned to her book, assuming it was just a typical argument between a couple. But as the weeks passed and Jessica's case remained unsolved, Margaret began to wonder if what she'd witnessed was connected to the disappearance. The timing was right, around 6 p.m. on October 12th. The location was significant. The same area where Jessica's phone was later found, and the description of the woman matched what Jessica had been wearing. Margaret finally called the police tip line on November 8th. Detective Reyes interviewed her that same day, bringing along a collection of photos including Jessica's picture. Margaret studied the photos carefully, but couldn't definitively identify Jessica as the woman she'd seen. The distance and lighting conditions had been too poor for her to make out facial features clearly. But Margaret's account was compelling because of its specificity. She remembered checking her clock when she first heard the argument. It had been 6:05 p.m. She described the woman's clothing as a light green or gray top with dark pants, consistent with what Jessica had been wearing. Most importantly, Margaret was certain about the confrontational nature of the interaction. Detective Reyes asked Margaret to work with a police sketch artist to create a composite drawing of the second person she'd seen. The process was challenging because Margaret's view had been from above and at a distance, but she was able to provide some general characteristics: tall, possibly male, wearing dark clothing including what might have been a hooded jacket. By now, forensic analysis of Jessica's phone had yielded some results. Despite the water damage, technicians had been able to recover partial data from the device. The phone's last activity was recorded at 6:03 p.m. on October 12th, a failed attempt to make a phone call. The call had lasted only a few seconds and hadn't connected to any number. More significantly, the phone's GPS data showed that it had been in the Hawthorne Bridge area at the time of its last activity. This was the first concrete evidence placing Jessica in that location on the evening she disappeared. The timing was remarkable. Margaret Chen had witnessed an argument at 6:05 p.m. Jessica's phone had attempted to make a call at 6:03 p.m. from the same general area. The correlation was too strong to be coincidental. Detective Reyes now had what investigators call a critical incident, a specific time and place where something significant had happened to Jessica. But she still didn't know who Jessica had encountered or what had happened after the confrontation Margaret witnessed. The investigation now focused intensively on identifying the person Margaret had seen arguing with Jessica. Detective Reyes re-examined all the security footage from the area, looking specifically for anyone matching the general description Margaret had provided. She also expanded the canvas of the Hawthorne Bridge area, interviewing everyone who lived or worked nearby. The detective was looking for anyone who might have seen the confrontation or noticed suspicious activity that evening. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source. James Walsh, a food cart owner who operated near the bridge, had been working late on October 12th, preparing for a catering order the next day. Around 6:10 p.m., he'd noticed someone walking quickly past his cart, moving toward the river path. James described the person as tall, wearing a dark hooded jacket, and moving with purpose rather than the casual pace of typical evening walkers. The person had kept their hood up despite the fact that it wasn't raining at that moment. What made James's observation particularly valuable was that his food cart had a security camera. The camera was positioned to monitor the cart itself, but its wide angle captured part of the nearby sidewalk. When Detective Reyes reviewed the footage, she could see a figure matching James's description, walking past at 6:11 p.m. The video quality was poor, and the person's face wasn't visible due to the hood, but it provided confirmation that someone had left the confrontation scene and headed toward downtown Portland. The figure's gait and posture suggested urgency, possibly agitation. Detective Reyes now had a timeline of events for Jessica's last known hours. 4:35 p.m. Jessica left her office building. 5:15 p.m. Jessica failed to appear for her dental appointment. 6:03 p.m. Jessica's phone attempted a call from the Hawthorne Bridge area. 6:05 p.m. Margaret Chen witnessed an argument between two people. 6:11 p.m. A hooded figure was captured on security camera leaving the area, but Jessica herself had vanished somewhere between 6:05 p.m. and when the hooded figure left the scene. Detective Reyes feared the worst, but without a body or additional evidence, she couldn't make any definitive conclusions about Jessica's fate. The case had now attracted regional and even national attention. Jessica's story had been featured on several true crime podcasts, and social media campaigns continued to share her photo and case details. The Portland Police Bureau was receiving tips from across the country, though most proved to be false leads or mistaken sightings. Maria Martinez had remained in Portland throughout November, coordinating with volunteer search groups and working to keep her sister's case in the public eye. She'd taken a leave of absence from her teaching job and was staying in Jessica's apartment, caring for Mochi and maintaining hope that her sister would somehow return. As November turned to December, Detective Reyes continued following leads and re-examining evidence. She'd identified several persons of interest, people who had interacted with Jessica in the weeks before her disappearance, individuals with criminal histories who lived or worked in the area, and anyone who matched the general description of the person Margaret Chen had seen. But none of these investigations had yielded solid evidence. The hooded figure remained unidentified, and Jessica Martinez remained missing. On December 12th, exactly 2 months after Jessica's disappearance, Detective Reyes received a call that would provide the case's final piece of crucial evidence. A construction worker named Mike Torres had been demolishing an old warehouse in southeast Portland when he discovered something that made him immediately call police. Hidden beneath debris in the warehouse basements, Mike had found a leather messenger bag. The bag matched the description of the one Jessica had been carrying on the day she disappeared. Detective Reyes rushed to the construction site. The warehouse was about 2 miles from the Hawthorne Bridge area, in an industrial section of Portland that was undergoing redevelopment. The building had been abandoned for several years and was scheduled for demolition to make way for new condominiums. Inside the messenger bag, investigators found Jessica's wallet, containing her ID and credit cards. They found her work badge, some design sketches, and most heartbreakingly, a small framed photo of Mochi that Jessica kept in her bag. But they found no other trace of Jessica herself. The warehouse discovery confirmed that Jessica had met with foul play. Someone had taken her belongings and hidden them in an abandoned building, suggesting premeditation and an attempt to conceal evidence. But the person responsible had vanished as completely as Jessica herself. As our story reaches its end tonight, Jessica Martinez remains missing. Her case is still active with the Portland Police Bureau, and Detective Reyes continues to follow leads and investigate tips. The FBI has joined the investigation, and Jessica's disappearance has been entered into national missing persons databases. The hooded figure from the security footage has never been identified. The person who argued with Jessica on the Hawthorne Bridge that October evening remains unknown. And somewhere in Portland or beyond, someone knows what happened to Jessica Martinez on that rainy Thursday night. Jessica's family continues to hope for answers. Maria Martinez has returned to Sacramento, but travels to Portland regularly to coordinate with police and maintain search efforts. Mochi now lives with Maria, a small comfort in an ongoing tragedy. The Portland community hasn't forgotten Jessica either. Her photo still appears on bulletin boards around the city, and volunteer groups continue to distribute flyers and search for any trace of her. Every few months, new tips come in, each one investigated thoroughly by Detective Reyes and her team. Jessica's case has become part of Portland's collective memory. a reminder that even in a close-knit community where neighbors look out for each other, people can vanish without explanation. It's a sobering reality that thousands of families across the country face each year: the absence of answers, the weight of not knowing, the hope that someday truth will emerge from mystery. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll spare a thought for Jessica Martinez and the thousands of missing persons whose cases remain unsolved. Their families wait for phone calls that may never come, for discoveries that might bring closure, for the day when mystery becomes truth and uncertainty becomes peace. If you have any information about Jessica's disappearance, the Portland Police Bureau asks that you call their tip line. Every detail matters. Every memory could be significant. Every call might be the one that finally brings Jessica home. Story 5. This story centers on 31-year-old David Rodriguez, a cybersecurity expert whose vanishing from a secure downtown Denver office building has left more questions than answers. David's case is particularly intriguing because of the digital footprints he left behind: a trail of encrypted messages, mysterious online transactions, and security footage that seems to show impossible things. Some investigators believe David orchestrated his own disappearance. Others think something far more disturbing occurred. The truth, as we'll discover, may be somewhere in between. What makes this case especially compelling is that David wasn't just any tech worker. He was a cybersecurity specialist who understood surveillance, digital tracking, and how to disappear online. If anyone could vanish without a trace, it would be someone like David Rodriguez. But the question remains: did he choose to disappear, or was that choice made for him? David Michael Rodriguez was born on a snowy December morning in 1991, right here in Denver, to Maria and Carlos Rodriguez. His father worked as a mechanic for the city's transportation department, while his mother was a kindergarten teacher at a local elementary school. They lived in a modest two-bedroom house in the Westwood neighborhood, where David would spend the first 18 years of his life. Even as a child, David was fascinated by technology. While other kids his age were playing video games, David was taking apart old computers that his uncle brought home from the telecommunications company where he worked. By age 12, David had built his first functioning computer from spare parts, much to his parents' amazement and slight concern. His teachers at Abraham Lincoln High School quickly recognized David's exceptional abilities. He was the kid who could fix the school's computer lab when the IT person couldn't figure out what was wrong. He created websites for local businesses before he could even drive. His computer science teacher, Mrs. Petra Henderson, would later tell reporters that David was unlike any student she'd ever taught. He didn't just understand computers, she said. He understood how systems worked, how they could be manipulated, and more importantly, how they could be protected. Even in high school, he was thinking about cybersecurity in ways that were years ahead of his time. David graduated valedictorian and earned a full scholarship to the University of Colorado Boulder, where he double majored in computer science and applied mathematics. It was during his sophomore year that he first became interested in cybersecurity, after a campus-wide network breach compromised thousands of student records. While his classmates were partying or stressing about exams, David spent his free time learning about network penetration, encryption protocols, and digital forensics. He interned with the FBI's cybercrime division during his junior year, an opportunity that opened doors and shaped his understanding of how digital crimes were investigated. After graduation, David was recruited by several major tech companies, but he chose to stay in Denver, accepting a position with CyberShield Technologies, a growing cybersecurity firm with offices in the prestigious Denver Tech Center. The company specialized in protecting financial institutions and government agencies from cyber attacks. David's colleagues described him as brilliant, but reserved. He was the person everyone turned to when they encountered a problem they couldn't solve. He had an uncanny ability to think like a hacker, to anticipate vulnerabilities before they could be exploited. This skill made him invaluable to CyberShield and earned him rapid promotions. By 2023, at just 31 years old, David was CyberShield's senior cybersecurity analyst, with a salary that allowed him to purchase a sleek downtown loft in the trendy Reno district. He drove a modest Honda Civic despite his substantial income, preferring to spend his money on high-end computer equipment and cryptocurrency investments. David lived alone and seemed to prefer it that way. He'd had a few serious relationships over the years, but nothing that lasted. His most recent girlfriend, Jessica Park, a graphic designer he'd met through a mutual friend, had broken up with him 6 months before his disappearance. David was incredibly intelligent, but he lived in his head a lot. Jessica would later tell investigators. He was always thinking about some new security protocol or worried about some potential cyber threats. It was like he saw dangers everywhere that the rest of us couldn't see. This was the David Rodriguez who existed on February 14th, 2020, a man who understood the digital world better than most, who made his living protecting others from online threats, and who was about to become the center of a mystery that would challenge everything investigators thought they knew about disappearances in the digital age. The week leading up to David's disappearance started normally enough. February 6th through 10th, 2023, followed David's typical routine with almost mechanical precision. His keycard records show he arrived at CyberShield's offices each day between 8:15 and 8:30 a.m., staying until somewhere between 6:30 and 7. CyberShield occupied 3 floors of a modern glass building on South Colorado Boulevard, with views of the Rocky Mountains to the west and the Denver skyline to the north. The building itself was a fortress of security, keycard access at every door, cameras in every hallway, and a sophisticated visitor management system that tracked everyone who entered or left. David's workstation was on the 14th floor in what employees called the Vault, a secure area where the company's most sensitive projects were handled. Access to this floor required special clearance, and all electronic devices had to be checked at a security station before entry. That week, David was working on what would later be described as one of the most important projects of his career. CyberShield had been contracted by a consortium of Denver area banks to investigate a series of sophisticated cyber attacks that had been probing their systems for weaknesses. The attacks were unlike anything David had seen before. Instead of the typical brute force methods used by most cyber criminals, these intrusions showed an intimate knowledge of banking security protocols. Someone wasn't just trying to break into these systems, they understood exactly how the systems worked. David's colleague and closest friend at work, Michael Chen, noticed that David seemed more focused than usual that week, staying later than normal, and taking work home with him, which was unusual. David was always professional about maintaining work-life boundaries. Michael would later tell investigators, he never took sensitive files home, never discussed ongoing cases outside the office. But that week, he seemed really invested in this banking project. He kept saying he was close to figuring out who was behind the attacks. On Thursday, February 9th, David did something that his coworkers found odd. During the team's weekly security briefing, he asked detailed questions about the company's own security protocols. He wanted to know about camera blind spots, backup power systems, and emergency evacuation procedures. When his supervisor, Janet Morrison, asked why he needed this information, David explained that he was working on a comprehensive security audit for a potential client. The explanation seemed reasonable, but Janet would later remember feeling like there was something David wasn't telling her. That same Thursday evening, David's behavior at home was also unusual. His downstairs neighbor, Patricia Williams, a retired teacher who often heard David's footsteps above her apartment, noticed that he seemed to be moving furniture around until very late at night. Usually David was very quiet, Patricia told police. You'd hardly know anyone lived above you. But Thursday night, it sounded like he was rearranging his entire apartment. I heard heavy objects being moved, like he was packing or unpacking something significant. Friday, February 10th, was David's last normal day at work. Security footage shows him arriving at 8:22 a.m., looking tired but otherwise unremarkable. He spent most of the day in meetings related to the banking security project, and his keycard records show he accessed the vault area multiple times throughout the day. What investigators would later find significant was that David accessed several areas of the building that weren't related to his current projects. He visited the building's server room, the emergency stairwells, and even the parking garage's security office, all areas he normally had no reason to visit. At 4:30 p.m. that Friday, David did something that would later seem prophetic. He backed up all of his work files to CyberShield's secure cloud system, a routine task that employees were supposed to do weekly but that David typically did monthly. His last email of the day was sent at 6:45 p.m. to his supervisor. Banking project analysis complete. We'll have full report ready Monday morning. Have a good weekend. Simple, professional, and giving no indication of what was to come. David left the office at 7:12 p.m., taking his usual route to the parking garage. Security cameras show him walking normally, carrying his laptop bag and coffee mug. He appeared to exchange pleasantries with a security guard, just as he did every day. What no one knew at the time was that this would be the last confirmed sighting of David Rodriguez as a free man. The weekend ahead would change everything, setting in motion a chain of events that investigators are still trying to understand. Saturday, February 11th, 2023 was a typical winter day in Denver. The temperature hovered around 35 degrees, with overcast skies threatening snow that would eventually begin falling that evening. For most people, it was a day to stay inside, catch up on errands, or spend time with family. David's Saturday routine was usually predictable. He'd sleep in until around 9 a.m., spend the morning reading tech blogs and news sites, then use the afternoon for grocery shopping, laundry, or working on personal coding projects. Saturdays were his decompression time from the intense focus required by his job. But this Saturday was different. David's phone records show unusual activity starting early in the morning. At 6:47 a.m., he received a text message from an unknown number, package ready for pickup. Location confirmed. David responded immediately. Understood. Timeline remains the same. Investigators would later spend months trying to trace this number, but it led to a dead end. A prepaid phone purchased with cash from a Denver electronics store, paid for by someone who avoided all the store's security cameras. At 8:15 a.m., David made a purchase that would later puzzle investigators. $28 and $47 worth of Bitcoin, bought through 3 different cryptocurrency exchanges. This was significant because David, despite his tech background, had always been skeptical of cryptocurrency, often telling friends that he preferred traditional investments. His credit card records show he left his Reno loft around 10:30 a.m., first stopping at a UPS store where he mailed a package to an address in Portland, Oregon. The recipient was listed as Jay Morrison, not his supervisor Janet Morrison, but someone with the same last name. Investigators would later discover that no one by that name lived at the Portland address. From there, David drove to REI, the outdoor equipment store in the Cherry Creek shopping district. Security footage shows him purchasing a large hiking backpack, sleeping bag, water purification tablets, and several days' worth of freeze-dried camping food. The total came to... The REI purchase was particularly puzzling because David wasn't known as an outdoor enthusiast. His idea of recreation was usually playing video games or working on coding projects. His ex-girlfriend Jessica later told police that David had never expressed any interest in camping or hiking during their relationship. After REI, David made one more stop that Saturday, a visit to his parents' house in Westwood. His mother, Maria, would later tell investigators that David seemed different during this visit, more affectionate than usual, but also distracted. He hugged me longer than normal when he arrived, Maria Rodriguez recalled. He kept looking around the house like he was trying to memorize it. When I asked if everything was okay, he said work was stressful but that things would be better soon. David spent about 2 hours at his parents' house, helping his father Carlos with a computer problem and eating lunch with them. Before leaving, he gave his mother an envelope, telling her it contained some important documents and asking her to put it in her safe deposit box without opening it. He made me promise not to look inside unless something happened to him, Maria said. I thought he was being dramatic. David was always worried about digital security, identity theft, things like that. I figured it was just more of his paranoia about online safety. David left his parents' house around 3:30 p.m. His phone's GPS data shows he drove directly back to his downtown loft, arriving at 4:15 p.m. What happened next remains one of the most puzzling aspects of the entire case. Security cameras in David's apartment building show him entering through the main lobby at 4:18 p.m. He appeared normal, carrying shopping bags from his various stops. The cameras show him taking the elevator to the 12th floor, where his loft was located. But here's where things get strange. The hallway camera on the 12th floor malfunctioned at 4:22 p.m., just as David would have been walking to his apartment. The malfunction lasted exactly 27 minutes, from 4:22 to 4:49 p.m. When the camera came back online, the hallway was empty. Building maintenance records show no scheduled work on the camera system that day. The malfunction appeared to be random, but investigators would later question whether someone with David's technical expertise could have caused it intentionally. David's phone remained active until 11:47 p.m. that Saturday night. His last text message was sent to his friend Michael Chen. "See you Monday. Big day coming up." Michael thought nothing of it at the time, assuming David was referring to the banking security presentation he was scheduled to give on Monday morning. Sunday, February 12th, passed quietly. David's phone showed no activity after midnight. His credit cards weren't used, and building security cameras showed no sign of him leaving his apartment. To anyone monitoring his digital footprint, it appeared that David Rodriguez was having a quiet Sunday at home. But appearances, as investigators would soon learn, can be deceiving. Monday morning, February 13th, 2023, started normally at CyberShield Technologies. Employees arrived for another week of protecting their clients from digital threats, unaware that one of their own had seemingly vanished into thin air. David's absence wasn't immediately noticed. He wasn't scheduled for any meetings until 10 a.m., and it wasn't unusual for senior analysts to work flexible hours, especially when they were deep into complex projects. Michael Chen was the first to realize something was wrong. At 9:45 a.m., he walked to David's workstation to discuss the banking security presentation. David's desk was unusually clean. No coffee cup, no scattered notes, none of the controlled chaos that usually characterized his workspace. Michael checked David's calendar and saw the 10 a.m. presentation clearly marked. He tried calling David's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. He sent a text. "Where are you? Client meeting in 15 minutes. The message showed as delivered, but was never read. By 10:30 a.m., when David still hadn't appeared for the presentation, Michael escalated to their supervisor, Janet Morrison. Janet tried calling David herself, with the same results. She made the decision to reschedule the client meeting, telling them that David had a family emergency. "I was trying to protect David," Janet would later explain. "We all have bad days, personal crises. I thought maybe he'd overslept or had some kind of emergency. I never imagined he had actually disappeared." But as the day progressed without any word from David, concern grew. By 3 p.m., Janet decided to take action. She called building security and asked them to perform a welfare check on David's apartment. The Denver Police Department was contacted when building security reported they couldn't get any response from David's apartments. Officer Sarah Mitchell arrived at 4:20 p.m., accompanied by the building manager and a maintenance worker. What they found when they entered David's loft would baffle investigators for months to come. The apartment was immaculate, far cleaner than anyone who knew David would have expected. The refrigerator had been emptied and cleaned, the trash had been taken out, and all of David's clothes were neatly organized in his closet. But it was what was missing that caught Officer Mitchell's attention. David's laptop was gone, along with his cell phone charger, his passport, and several pieces of clothing that his mother would later identify as his favorites. On David's dining room table, arranged with almost ceremonial precision, were 3 items: his CyberShield employee ID badge, his apartment keys, and a handwritten note that simply read, "I'm sorry. Don't look for me." The note was verified as being in David's handwriting, but forensic analysis would later reveal something odd. The pen used to write it was a brand David had never purchased, according to his credit card records, and the testimony of people who knew his preferences. In David's home office, investigators found something even more puzzling. His desktop computer was still there, but the hard drive had been completely wiped using military-grade deletion software. It would have taken hours to complete this process, and it required advanced technical knowledge to do it properly. Detective Amanda Foster, the lead investigator assigned to the case, immediately recognized that this wasn't a typical missing person situation. Everything about the scene suggested that David had planned his disappearance carefully. Detective Foster would later explain. But there were also elements that didn't make sense. If someone is planning to disappear voluntarily, why leave a note apologizing? Why go to such lengths to clean the apartment? It felt like someone was trying very hard to make this look like a planned disappearance. The investigation officially began that evening, but investigators quickly realized they were dealing with someone who understood exactly how missing person cases were investigated. David had eliminated most of the digital breadcrumbs that typically help police track missing individuals. His phone was turned off, and couldn't be located. His laptop was gone. His social media accounts showed no activity. His bank accounts remained untouched. For someone whose entire life was built around digital technology, David Rodriguez had managed to go completely offline. But as investigators would soon discover, even the most carefully planned disappearances leave traces. The question was whether those traces would lead them to David or to whoever wanted him to vanish. As the investigation into David Rodriguez's disappearance deepened, Detective Foster and her team realized they were dealing with something unprecedented, a cybersecurity expert who had vanished using his own expertise against the very systems designed to find him. The first breakthrough came 3 days after David's disappearance, when FBI cybercrime specialists were brought in to analyze David's wiped computer. Using advanced forensic techniques, they were able to recover fragments of deleted data that painted a disturbing picture. Hidden in the computer's temporary files were traces of encrypted communications dating back 6 weeks before David's disappearance. The messages were heavily coded, but their pattern suggested that David had been communicating with someone about a complex plan. One partially recovered message fragment read, "Security window confirmed 4/22/449. Package contents verified. Final transfer scheduled for Valentine's Day." The reference to the specific time window matched exactly when the hallway camera in David's building had malfunctioned. Meanwhile, investigators discovered that the Bitcoin David had purchased on his last Saturday was transferred to multiple cryptocurrency wallets within hours of his disappearance. The transfers used a sophisticated mixing service that made the transactions nearly impossible to trace. But the most chilling discovery came when investigators examined David's work at CyberShield more closely. The banking security project he'd been working on wasn't just about defending against cyber attacks. David had been mapping every vulnerability in the Denver Banking Consortium's systems. His colleague Michael Chen helped investigators understand the implications. David wasn't just finding weaknesses to fix them. He had created a complete blueprint for someone who wanted to attack these systems. Everything someone would need to steal millions of dollars was in his final report. The report that David had promised to deliver on Monday morning was never found on CyberShield's servers. If it existed, David had taken it with him. As the investigation continued, a new theory emerged. David Rodriguez hadn't disappeared voluntarily. He had been recruited, possibly coerced, to provide inside information about banking security systems to sophisticated cybercriminals. The envelope David had left with his mother was finally opened, revealing a complex set of instructions for accessing a safety deposit box in a bank across town. Inside that box, investigators found $50,000 in cash and a flash drive containing what appeared to be a confession. In a video recorded just days before his disappearance, David looked directly into the camera and spoke words that would haunt everyone who knew him. "If you're watching this and something has gone wrong, I thought I could outsmart them, thought I could take their money and disappear before they realized what I'd done. But people like this don't let loose ends survive. I'm sorry to everyone I'm leaving behind. I hope you understand that I didn't have a choice." The video ended abruptly, but forensic analysis revealed that it had been edited. Someone had removed portions of David's statement, possibly to hide information about his collaborators or his ultimate fate. Today, more than a year after David Rodriguez vanished from his Denver loft, investigators continue to follow leads across the country. His banking consortium project was shelved indefinitely after his disappearance, and CyberShield implemented new security protocols to prevent insider threats. David's parents still believe their son is alive somewhere, possibly in witness protection or hiding from the criminals who recruited him. Others, including Detective Foster, fear that David's expertise made him too dangerous to keep alive once he had served his purpose. The case remains open, one of the most complex digital disappearances in Colorado history. In a world where almost everyone leaves constant digital traces, David Rodriguez managed to vanish completely, either through his own brilliant planning or because someone else applied that same level of expertise to make him disappear. As Denver continues to grow as a tech hub, David's case serves as a reminder that our increasing dependence on digital systems creates new vulnerabilities, not just for data and money, but for the people who understand those systems best. The truth about what happened to David Rodriguez may never be fully known, but his disappearance continues to influence How cybersecurity firms protect not just their clients' data, but their own employees who hold the keys to digital kingdoms worth millions of dollars. In the mile-high city, where the mountains keep their secrets and the digital world offers infinite places to hide, David Rodriguez remains a ghost, present in the systems he helped protect, absent from the world he once called home. And that brings us to the end of today's story. Whether David Rodriguez chose his fate or had it chosen for him, his case reminds us that in our connected world, disappearing completely requires either incredible skill or incredible danger, and sometimes it's impossible to tell which one is true. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.